pas de soleil, 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 pas de soleil,
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the July 2024 Council Agenda Briefing. We acknowledge and pay our respects to the traditional custodians of this land, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and their elders past and present. I'd like to advise everyone that the audio recording of this meeting is being live streamed to YouTube. I request that everyone please turn off their mobile phones. I remind you that audio recording of the meeting proceedings and photography within the chamber is prohibited unless prior approval has been granted, and councillors and city officers are reminded to disclose any declarations of financial interests and interests affecting impartiality, and are requested to activate their microphones when addressing the meeting. So, with that, we turn to item 1, which is the declaration of opening. Welcome, everyone. I declare this meeting open at 1 minute past 6 p.m. Items for council. Agenda items 2, 3, 6, 7, 8.1, 8.2, 9, 11, 13 and 14 will be dealt with at the ordinary council meeting to be held on 23 July 2024. That brings us to item 4, which is attendances. Item 4.1 is apologies. I haven't received any apologies for tonight. I understand that Councillor Cridland is currently caught up in traffic and will be with us very shortly. Item 4.2 is approved leaves of absence, and that's nil for this evening. Item 5 is declarations of interest. Mayor Greg Milner, that's me. I've declared an impartiality interest in item 10.1.1 as I am a former co-patron of Wasps Hockey Club. Councillor Hayley Prendeville has declared an impartiality interest in item 10.1.1 as myself and my family are members of Wasps Hockey Club. My involvement extends to numerous committee positions, one of those positions being president. I'm currently Minky coordinator. And Councillor Bronwyn Waugh has declared an impartiality interest in item 10.1.1 as my son attends Wesley College but does not play hockey. Councillors, does anyone else have? Councillor Choi.
Yes, thank you, Mr Mayor. I also need to disclose an impartiality interest in that same item, as my sons also attend Wesley College and have played for the Wasp Hockey Club, as has my husband, who is also a Wesley old boy. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Choi. Councillors, any other declarations to be made this evening? That's a no, although I will give Councillor Cridland an opportunity when he arrives if he wishes to declare anything. That brings us to item 8, which is presentations. Item 8.3 is deputations. This evening we will have 13 speakers who will have up to 10 minutes in total to address council. We've got 13 speakers, but I do note councillors also received 3 deputations that have since been withdrawn. They were all on the item 12.3. 2 of those were in favour and 1 of them were against. But to begin, I'd like to invite Ms Kathy Lees of South Perth, who is speaking for the officer recommendation at item 10.3.1. Welcome, Ms Lees. The microphone is yours and we look forward to your deputation.
There's a PowerPoint
Matt Morgan,
presentation.
Have we got a clicker or?
We do.
Okay, good evening Mayor, councillors and city officers and attendees.
Oh no, hang on, what have I done? Sorry.
Just don't worry about clicking. What have you done? There we go. So I'm speaking here tonight in support of the draft tree retention local planning policy as a long-term resident of South Perth and also, as you know, as co-founder of South Perth Tree Canopy Advocates and also a co-founder of the WA Tree Canopy Advocates. So I've got a slideshow here that will just run in the background to just give you some examples of images of what we're dealing with and also some positive outcomes that seem to be few and far between, and why we're here tonight to talk about this tree retention policy. So South Perth TCA has over 900 followers, and the WA Tree Canopy Advocates have over 25,000 followers and 26 local groups at present across Perth and WA regional centres. These people are all concerned about our canopy crisis, and these people are all watching and desperately hoping that you, as the council, show strong leadership and adopt the draft tree retention local planning policy next Tuesday night. We are very grateful that you have continued to pursue tree protections despite the Minister for Planning's rejection of the provisions you proposed in Local Planning Scheme number 7 earlier this year. The community strongly supported the draft planning provisions in Local Planning Scheme number 7, and they are still strongly in support of the local planning policy proposed now, with 70.3% of submissions in support, including 63.4% of submissions received from South Perth residents in support. So this is a really strong mandate that needs to be recognised by you all and acted on. The research on the benefits of trees is endless and indisputable, and I've sat up here and spoken about those many times. And the majority of community, I believe, understands this. But protections for our large, healthy trees are more urgent now than ever as the effects of climate change intensify, as evidenced by the longest, hottest and driest summer we have just experienced in Perth. And on top of this, the spread of the polyphagous shot-hole borer. We've lost over 3,000 trees already to that borer in Perth so far, and that's just the beginning. So our large, healthy trees are under threat. Oops. Turn the page. We know that 80% of tree canopy is being lost on private land, in and around our homes where it is most needed. So as fast as trees are being planted on public land, they are being lost on private land. In 2006, it was determined that each street tree contributes to wellness with about $117,000 of benefit over its lifespan. So this same figure applies to trees on private land. And if you add in the many benefits of large trees, including carbon capture, and you allow for inflation since 2006, the dollar value of our existing urban trees, the remaining ones, in combination is significant. We must understand that each time a large healthy tree that has taken 40 plus years to grow is chopped down, there is a significant cost to the community. The local planning policy is based on the WA Local Government Association template. It has been well thought through. It's backed by legal advice. It is a well-considered, balanced approach to the regulation of tree removal on private property. It essentially echoes the draft LPS 7 tree protection provisions that you as a council signed off last year, and we urge you as a council to remain consistent on this and adopt the local planning policy now. Nothing has changed since then, with the exception that this is now more urgent. It's really important to recognise that the provisions do not prohibit tree removal, they are not anti-density or anti-development, and they need not add to the cost of development. If a large tree is located so that it makes development unviable, its removal could be approved. Similarly, if a tree poses a serious safety risk to people or property, its removal could be approved. They simply require development approval for the removal of a large tree to ensure that they are not needlessly removed before an application for new development is lodged. They seek to avoid mindless clearing of sites at the same time buildings on a site are demolished, as some of these slides display. They seek to ensure that all feasible and cost-effective opportunities to retain large trees and integrate them into new development are exhausted before they are removed. This is something that the R-codes incentives that have been in place for some time now are just failing to achieve. So maintenance pruning is allowed under the provisions, and more significant pruning can be easily and quickly approved by the city if it is obviously not intended to harm the tree. And on this note, we acknowledge and fully support the recommendation to waive the $147 application fee. The Planning and Development Act 2005 specifically prescribes the preservation of trees can be addressed by a planning scheme. So the suggestion that this policy is government overreach is simply not true. In contrast, Local Planning Scheme number 7 has virtually no provisions to address the preservation of trees, with the Minister for Planning even removing the less than effective significant tree register provisions when he approved the scheme earlier this year. Arguments regarding the protection of private property rights just don't stack up. The purpose of the local planning scheme is to deliver orderly and proper planning that protects our collective amenity. None of us live in isolation. We don't live on islands. We are part of a community, and we all need to remember this. As indicated in the Council report, the policy aligns with the state government's own private property rights charter for Western Australia adopted in 2021. WA is the only state without tree protections, like those proposed here. And as a consequence, not surprisingly, our canopy cover in Perth is the lowest of any capital city. Working as a town planner at North Sydney Council in the 1990s, so some time ago, tree protections were in place way back then and were not questioned by the community. Life went on, the community accepted and understood the need for them, and they are now continuing to reap the benefits. Development has continued in this inner city area. It's a very dense inner city area of Sydney, but it is development that includes trees and has enabled it to retain its green leafy character, the character which we are in danger of losing without similar protections. The idea that somehow in WA we are unique and our private property rights are different to the rest of Australia is simply bizarre. In terms of penalties for removing a tree without removal, the $200,000 referenced in information provided with the policy is the maximum penalty for illegal works under the Planning and Development Act. So the maximum penalty for any illegal works. But the magistrate at the time determines the actual fine on a case-by-case basis, and it is highly unlikely that anything like this figure would be imposed for the removal of a tree. In any case, it is important to remember that the policy on its own will act as a deterrent, and realistically, we know that the city
60 seconds, Ms Lees.
very rarely prosecutes ratepayers for illegal development. The recommendation to delay the approval of the policy until canopy data is available is not supported. It's going to lead to preemptive development, preemptive removal of trees. We've seen that happening already. And there was a flyover done by Arbor Carbon in April that provides all the data that can be extracted from that point. So strongly recommend against that. So in conclusion, we urge you to show leadership, listen to the majority of the community and complete your great work by adopting the local planning policy next Tuesday for implementation without delay. It's time for change. It's time for us to catch up with the rest of Australia. The amenity and livability of our suburbs for future generations depends on it. Thank you.
Thank you for your deputation, Ms Lees. Councillors, any questions for Ms Lees? No. Thank you very much for your deputation. I'd now like to invite Ms Bronwyn David of South Perth, who is speaking for the officer recommendation at item 10.3.1. Welcome, Ms David. The microphone is yours. We look forward to the deputation.
Thank you very much, Mayor. Good evening, Mayor, councillors and city staff. The City of South Perth has been at the forefront of retaining the attractive and financially rewarding green canopy of our city from many years ago, inserting tree protection provisions in the original draft Local Planning Scheme 7, reinserting the provisions upon their removal, and then surveying the community about the issue, which resulted in one of the biggest responses to date for a council survey, with a huge majority in favour of tree protection provisions. Upon the rejection of the tree protection provisions in Local Planning Scheme number 7 by the Minister for Planning, the city has remained undaunted in delivering what a clear majority of citizens, residents want, and consequently this tree protection policy was developed. Again, the community has been surveyed, and again, almost 2/3 of local residents have responded in the positive, wanting to protect trees in the area for all the benefits that they give, maintaining the value of the properties in the suburb, food and shelter for local wildlife, environmental benefits such as cooling the immediate neighbourhood, and community connection by providing shaded spaces for people to exercise and to meet outside their homes. So thank you for your leadership in this space. I know that many in the wider community are looking to you to pioneer this policy so that their council is emboldened to do the same in their area. We are a unique, valuable and attractive community thanks to the existing tree canopy cover, and we should do everything necessary to retain and grow it. At the same time that the city is pioneering tree protection in Western Australia, it's not a new concept. Sydney, Melbourne and Canberra have all had tree protection policies or regulations or laws for decades. These policies aren't novel. They can be seen to work. Each of those cities has a greater canopy coverage than Perth. Within those cities, the most valuable real estate is found in the greenest and shadiest suburbs. Development is not slowed by these provisions in those cities. The laws are simply part of the landscape. I'm possibly the only person in the room who has personal experience of these policies, as I lived for a period in Sydney, apart from, it seems, from Kathy. But I'm coming to it from the position of a homeowner. In my heavily treed back garden, which contained 3 date palms, we had a lone pencil pine, which was completely out of place and contributed nothing to the canopy. To take it out, I rang the council, and the council sent out a tree officer. The tree officer looked at the tree, looked at the other trees in the backyard, and simply said, "You're good to go." It was a simple exercise for an average landowner. It was also free to get that advice, so I congratulate the city on the initiative to waive the application fees for an application to remove a tree. I think it is imperative that, having taken so many steps over such a long time, that this policy is implemented immediately. As noted in the officer's report in the agenda, there is a likelihood of trees being preemptively removed at scale ahead of the policy measures being introduced. Preemptive removal of trees remains a risk during this period. Trees are lost every day in the city to the detriment of the value of our green suburbs and the birds and animals that rely on them for food and shelter. I understand that data already exists to identify relevant trees for enforcement purposes, although this may not be in the format that is immediately accessible, but I'm sure it is coming. I have no issue with the grace period for those homeowners who are accidentally caught by these provisions, but this policy has now been in the public consciousness for long enough that most people know it's coming. And in fact, talking to people, many people think it's already in place because it was in draft Local Planning Scheme number 7. I think that may have something to do with the lower number of responses to the most recent survey compared to the previous survey, because many people probably didn't realise they needed to comment again as they have commented before, or truly believe that they already have tree protection measures. To those respondents who claim that this policy represents local government overreach and that it is their business to do what they want on their own private property, I imagine they also objected to being told by the government that smoking might give them lung cancer or that wearing seatbelts might save their life in an accident. The lack of trees might not kill you as surely or as quickly as smoking or not wearing a seatbelt if your car is in an accident, but the lack of trees in an environment means that the environment is hotter and heat does kill. Extreme heat kills 5 million people a year worldwide. Heat kills more people in the US each year than floods, hurricanes or tornadoes. In Australia, in the 10 years from 2012 to 2022, extreme heat accounted for 7,104 hospitalisations and 293 deaths in that 10-year period, and it's only getting hotter. Western Australia is the hottest and driest state in Australia and has the lowest tree canopy coverage. Any measures undertaken so far have done next to nothing to slow the canopy decline. Not significant tree registers, not asking nicely, not ARC codes, not urban forest plans. There is a way of protecting canopy, a way that is well understood and has been implemented for more than half a century in other states. It is a policy such as the one you have before you, and the City of South Perth should be congratulated in developing this policy and leading the way in Western Australia.
Thank you for your deputation, Ms David. Councillors, does anyone have any questions for Ms David? No. Thank you very much for your deputation. I'd now like to invite Mr Michael Stocco, I hope I've pronounced that right, of Perth, who is speaking for the officer recommendation at item 10.3.2. Welcome to you, Mr Stocco. Have I pronounced your name correctly?
You have, thank you.
Oh, fantastic. Well, the microphone is yours and we look forward to your deputation.
Thank you. Good evening, Mayor and Councillors. My name is Michael Stocco from Urbanista Town Planning, and I'm here tonight on behalf of the landowners of number 151 Angelo Street with respect to item 10.3.2. I'm speaking in favour of the officer's recommendation for approval for the alterations and additions of the single house and change of use to home business at the subject site. The subject site is zoned residential R25 and is directly next door to a local centre zoned area located at the intersection of Angelo Street and Lawler Street. The subject site contains an existing 3-bed, 1-bath single house and currently holds an approval for a home occupation within the front 2 rooms of the dwelling. The application before you this evening seeks to change the land use to home business, as this better aligns with the new definition provided in the city's local planning scheme. The application also proposes to convert an additional bedroom into an office space. As outlined in the conditions of approval, the proposed home business will have a maximum of 2 external staff. It will only operate between Monday and Friday 8 to 5 and will only accommodate a maximum of 1 client or visitor per day with a maximum of 3 clients per week. The 2 existing offices are currently occupied by the resident and the resident's business partner who resides in another property within the City of South Perth. The proposed 3rd office space is intended for an employee and will increase the total office area to 44 square metres. In addition, the application also proposes the construction of a new bedroom at the rear of the existing dwelling and a carport at the rear of the property. The proposed bedroom extension is to be constructed adjacent to the dwelling's primary living space to provide a greater degree of privacy for the resident. The 2-bay carport and adjoining open-air car bay is proposed to be located at the rear of the property and will primarily be used by the resident and staff. The location of the proposed carport at the rear of the site allows for minimal impacts to the resident's outdoor living area and reduces impacts on the adjoining properties. The southern and western elevations of the carport are proposed to be enclosed, which will assist in mitigating any potential noise or light impacts that could arise from the parking of vehicles. In terms of the visitor and client parking, this could easily be accommodated within the existing driveway within the street setback area. The application was advertised to the surrounding neighbours who have raised concerns regarding the nature of the use and the potential impacts of the carport on their properties. The concerns have been dealt with swiftly by providing the City with amended plans and further justification to address the neighbours' concerns as detailed in the agenda report. The application before you tonight is different from the scheme amendment determined by yourselves last month. That application was to facilitate the possibility to expand the current business on a larger scale while still residing at the premise. We respectfully accept Council's decision and are happy to proceed with the officer's recommendation for tonight. Overall, the proposal is consistent with the requirements of the local planning framework and is not considered to result in any amenity impacts to the surrounding area. Accordingly, we seek Council support to approve the proposal as recommended by the City's officers. Thank you for the chance to speak tonight, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Mr Stocko, for your deputation. Councillors, do we have any questions for Mr Stocko this evening? No. Thank you very much for your deputation. I'd now like, actually, before I proceed to the next deputy, Councillor Cridland, we sort of did the declarations of interest earlier, but is there any declarations of interest you'd like to make?
Yes, there is, Mr Mayor, and that's in respect of 10.1.1. And my disclosure or declaration is an impartiality interest, and that is because two of my children used to play hockey for Wasps, and the site that Wasps are considering down at Collier Reserve is where I walk my dog each day.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to invite Mr Jack Regan and Rajai Wahab of South Perth, who are speaking for the officer recommendation at item 10.3.3. Welcome to you. Oh, we've got one of you. Perhaps you can just know which one we've got.
Jack Regan.
Hello, Jack. Hello, Mr Regan. Welcome to you. We look forward to your deputation.
Thank you. Good evening, elected members. My name is Jack Regan from Altus Planning, and I'm here tonight on behalf of my colleague Ben Laycott, who is currently interstate. It was also intended that our client would be here as he wanted to speak to you directly, but unfortunately he's unavailable. So I'll be speaking on his behalf as well. Altus Planning are the applicant's consultant town planner for item 10.3.3 on the agenda, and the purpose of my deputation tonight is to seek your endorsement of the officer recommendation to approve the proposed childcare premises. As of 1st of July 2024, a gap analysis of supply and demand for long daycare centre facilities in South Perth reveals a significant shortage. There are only 214 childcare places available for over 748 children aged under 5. The recent Civic Park development has led to an influx of residents in the area, consequently increasing the demand for childcare services. By way of background, the two buildings on the site were formerly dwellings built in 1935 and 1940. The proposal seeks to utilise the existing buildings with only minor external modifications and high-quality landscape outdoor play areas. The retention of the buildings complement other examples in the area, such as repurposing of the nearby South Perth Police Station. Doing so will maintain the character of the area with a high-quality standard known to the South Perth locality. The facility is proposed to accommodate 38 children at any one time, and 7 staff members, providing an intimate and more familiar environment for the children, where the families will feel more secure and comfortable developing close relationships with the educators and fostering a sense of community. A total of 6 car parking bays are proposed at the rear of the site, in line with the parking requirements of the Activity Centre Plan. The existing on-street parking available on both sides of Bowman Street will provide drop-off and pick-up opportunities for parents and caregivers, with an additional drop-off bay proposed on-site in front of the buildings. The proposal has also been assessed as consistent with the objectives and requirements of the applicable local planning policies, with supporting technical documents from acoustic, traffic and waste consultants. Our client, Panda Early Learning Centre, will provide a wealth of expertise to the community of South Perth, being a childcare provider that meets the requirements of the Education and Care Regulatory Unit, and who would deliver safety, stability, quality care and comprehensive community support to an area with limited childcare options. Accordingly, the proposal is considered to be one that will contribute positively to the mix of land uses in the transitioning centre zone and will not result in any adverse amenity impacts. We would also like to note that Panda Early Learning Centre will also contribute significantly to the community by supporting families in their pursuit of employment opportunities and a better work-life balance. They have long-standing experience in supporting mums of children, students from local schools and the broader community by offering work experience opportunities. Turning to the recommended conditions, we acknowledge that for the main, they are standard conditions, or conditions that would ordinarily expect to see on a development of this nature. We do, however, seek a minor wording change to condition 26 to insert the words "or similar" after masonry. That way, the applicant can consider alternative materials such as the Hebel panel fencing, which can provide the appearance sought by the planning framework through more cost-effective materials. The revised wording of the condition would therefore be: prior to the occupation of the development, the existing colorbond fence is to be replaced with masonry or similar side and rear boundary fencing of 1.8 metres in height to the satisfaction of the City of South Perth. Where the ground levels differ on either side of the fence, the required height shall be measured above the higher ground level. It should be noted that the acoustic assessment did not require any specific fencing materials, so the findings would not be compromised. Otherwise, I don't wish to take up any more of your time, so in closing, on behalf of my colleague and the applicant, I would like to thank the City's officers for their efforts in collaborating with the project team and for progressing the application to a favourable recommendation, which I hope you endorse at next week's council meeting. Thank you.
Thank you for your deputation, Mr Reagan. Councillors, any questions for Mr Reagan? Councillor D'Souza.
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and thank you, Mr Reagan, for your presentation. You mentioned Civic Heart as being, I guess, a big driver of the demand for childcare locally. Do you have any rough estimation of how much of that demand will be met by this proposal? Or?
I wouldn't have any sort of statistics to back that at present, no.
Any further questions, councillors? No. Thank you for your deputation, Mr Reagan. I'd now like to invite Ms Heather Schoberg of South Perth, who is speaking against the officer recommendation at item 10.3.3. Welcome to you, Ms Schoberg.
Thank you.
The microphone is yours. We look forward to your deputation.
Thank you. Okay, nice to see some familiar faces, and I know there's some faces around the table who I haven't met. My name is Heather Schoberg. I live right in the building right immediately adjacent to the proposed childcare centre in South Perth. I also should say, for those of you who are new, my background was here before I came to Perth, was in planning, and I spent 8 years on the equivalent of the Joint Development Assessment Panels of Western Australia. So I do have some background, and I was a bit dismayed to see the officer's report, which simply dismissed what I'd said without fully investigating it and without even including some of the critical points that I had made. The summary there of what I actually wrote is totally inadequate and disappointing, to say the least. I sent some photos. Is there someone who has those?
Governance, do we have those photos? I've got a copy here. Have the other councillors got a copy? Oh, it looks like you do. Yes, it looks like the councillors have it.
Yes, all right. There's a photo there. I think it's labelled photo 1. And it shows a picture taken from the apartment immediately below mine of where the childcare centre will be. You can see it's actually quite close, and in fact, I think it says on that piece of paper it's 37 metres from that actual area, and that is the area where children will be playing. In my submission, I wrote that the building that I live in is the second half of it. The top 4 floors are residences. The bottom 4 floors are offices. And I described the residents as all being over retirement age. There are 2 in their 90s and some in their 80s. So effectively, it's an aged care facility, but not a registered one. There are people who come there as carers, aged care for the aged people to assist them. And yet, in the response, I'm told that it doesn't matter who lives in the building. Well, actually, it does under the policy for childcare centres. They cannot be located in close proximity to aged care facilities. So there's just one of the things. Another thing is that the writer of the submission said that our building was a commercial office building and completely ignored the fact that there were 12 apartments on the top of the building. It's an 8-storey building, by the way, 4 stories of offices, 4 stories of apartments. So completely ignored that. An acoustic report has been written in ignorance of those being inhabited spaces. And in any case, I should think that people working in offices won't be really too impressed by having a lot of children nearby who are playing. And I say that with a background in education. Before my planning career, I was a teacher, and I worked at times as a child psychologist in early childhood education. So I'm well familiar with the noise and the racket that kids can make, and they're having a good time, and so they should, but not at the expense of those who live nearby. So that's a couple of the things. In addition, I drew attention to the conflict for traffic, which was in the original proposal 3 or 4 years ago, that there was a major conflict with traffic at that time, but that proposal was withdrawn. This one has traffic going down the driveway, and there's a photo there where you will see the front of the house of one of the houses this childcare centre is proposed for, and you will see a concrete area, part of which looks new and part of which is not. And it's that was added since I have been here. I've been in Perth for 7 years, and that was added, I don't know legally or not, but according to the person writing the officer's report, this is okay to be a drop-off area, even though the requirement is that people cannot park in setback areas. This is a setback area. You can't park in them. But apparently that's to be waived and people can park there. Now, it may be, and I don't know, I don't want to say something about what people have done unduly, but I don't know that that was legal when it was done, when that concrete was put there. So how can council go ahead and say, oh no, it's all right, they can park there, they can have their drop-off zone there. In addition, there are 38 children to attend this childcare centre. The dwell time, by the admission of those writing the report themselves, is 10 minutes. In other words, when a person comes in to drop their children off, it will take them 10 minutes to get them out of the car, into the centre, then back in the car and gone. Now, 38, that's 380 minutes. All right, some of them might have more than one kid in a car. So say you've got 20, still 200 minutes. Most of the kids who are going to be attending that place are going to be arriving at peak hour when all of the people are arriving at our office building. And there is another picture there which shows you the 3 driveways in a way. There's a down ramp, there's an up ramp, and there's the driveway into the proposed childcare centre. I see lots of traffic conflicts happening there at peak hour. It's quite busy at that time when you've got a lot of office people arriving for work, and you're going right beside them. In fact, there's not even a fence between them at this point in time. You're going to have people arriving with their children at the childcare centre. Wouldn't be my choice. And I also have 2 children who went to childcare. The requirement for a variation to the acoustic report, that they'll do it later on once the childcare centre is established, that's not on. I mean, we have surely some rights here, living right next door and having lived there for some time. Surely we have some right. And there's a policy here that says that we do. But the report is saying, oh, no, we won't bother too much about the acoustics at the moment. We'll look into that after it's established. So what's going to happen? Does the centre get closed down at that point? I've never heard of such a thing. And finally, just to to indicate the credibility or lack of it for this report, the writer said that there is an educational establishment at number 2 Hardy Street. Now, this was in response to a requirement for an educational establishment to be within 800 metres of the childcare centre. That presumably is because the childcare workers walk 4-year-olds to school for their kindergarten. The closest school like that is not at 2 Hardy Street, it's an office building to 2 Hardy Street. So whoever wrote this must have been Googling or looking at Google Maps. I don't
Ms Sjoberg, I've given you a fair bit of latitude, but no more criticisms of the professional staff, please.
All right, then, but it's a point in fact. 2 Hardy Street is not an educational institution. That is my point. And the closest ones are South Perth and St Columba's, which both have a 1.5 kilometres.
60 seconds remaining, Ms Sjoberg.
And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you for your deputation. Councillors, do we have any questions for Ms Sjoberg? No. Okay. All right. I'd now like to invite Mr Bill Gleeson of South Perth, who is speaking for the officer recommendation at item 10.4.3. Mr Gleeson, welcome. The microphone is yours and we look forward to your deputation.
Question, Mr Mayor.
Fire away, but it is time for deputations. There's someone left a piece of paper there.
But do I get the same latitude as the last person did?
Oh,
Speaking without notes.
You can speak without notes if you want to, Mr Gleeson. That's, I won't stop you doing that.
Thank you.
All right.
Mr Mayor, councillors, thank you. My daughter Nicole, who's my assistant tonight, thank you. Mr Mayor, I wish to thank the Council for supporting Councillor Choi's motion, resulting in this report 10.4.3 tonight. There are some people that may say that what I'm about to show Council is a bit of trivia. But for me, it is part of my personal history. Let's do it. These photos are councillors' photos that were given to the council, to councillors that a few days later after they were sworn in. It's a memento of the council they represented on the day. I have a number of these over the years. Thank you. I'm also very privileged to have been given the name plates of my term of office. I've even put it in lights. Will you tend to that? Unfortunately, we can't plug it in. Pretty rare, thank you. I'll leave it up. Mr Mayor, councillors, the office recommendation should read, the modified honour boards that have had clear stroke frost or the appropriate product applied to be placed back on the back of the honour boards so they can be more legible. 2. The large frame pictures of former elected members and honour boards be placed back in the council reception room. The honour boards on the left-hand side of the walls as you enter the room, and the large photos of elected members on the right-hand side of the wall. In doing so, placing them back prior to their removal back in their rightful place. 13.7, the date. Mr Mayor, councillors, further to my early submission, which I've just read, which was written before the report 10.4.3, I would like to thank Mr Morgan Henley, Governance Coordinator Officer, who wrote the report that's before you tonight. The council and the residents of South Perth should be more than grateful that we have Mr Henley as a staff member. His report tonight, whilst I differ on some points, are very thoughtful, provoking, and has covered a large round of options regarding the honour boards. The report 10.3.4 has highlighted a number of options for consideration by the council. One option would be given that report and its variables should be, the option would be given the report and its variables should be differed from 1 month for the, should be deferred. One option should be deferred for 1 month for the council to be able to read thoroughly the report and question Mr Morgan on the options that can be regarding the honour boards. Given this was a personal interest of mine to get the history of the past elected members back on the wall, I have given this my best shot in promoting the subject. I'll now leave it up to the council to make their decision. Thank you.
Thank you for your deputation, Mr Gleeson. Councillors, does anyone have any questions for Mr Gleeson this evening? No. Thank you for your deputation. I'd now like to invite Mr Ryan Lanigan of East Victoria Park, who is speaking for the notice of motion recommendation at item 12.1. Welcome to you, Mr Lanigan. The microphone is yours and we look forward to your deputation.
Thank you, Mayor. That's a tough act to follow, Bill. Thank you. Thank you, Mayor and councillors, for the opportunity to support this significant motion. I also want to recognise and thank the City of South Perth staff, in particular CEO Mike Bradford and Director of Development and Community Services Donna Shaw. Your ongoing dialogue and support of us as an association is appreciated. I'd also like to recognise Anthony Mio, President of the Perth Reds, who's here tonight and we will be hearing from soon, and other Perth Reds members. My name is Ryan Lanigan. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Perth Basketball Association, also known as the Perth Redbacks. The Perth Basketball Association was formed in 1964. We, as of today, serve an area that consists of 500,000 residents, and that includes the City of South Perth. Of our 2,800 members, 99% of them are under the age of 18. This includes 250 junior teams from 9 domestic clubs, 35 junior representative teams, and our franchise men's and women's teams competing in the NBL 1, known colloquially as the Perth Redbacks. For us to facilitate that magnitude of competition and development within our basketball services, we utilise somewhere close to 35 venues per week. We have, on top of those active participants, another 1,000 participants, another 1,000 kids who cannot play basketball and are on a waiting list. Ausplay research indicates that on average across Australia, 5.5% of the population play basketball, and there is a need for 1 indoor court for every 6,250 residents. Across our catchment region, this equates to 27,500 active basketball players, and again showing that there is a significant deficit of participation in basketball due to a lack of courts. The landscape of basketball in WA. Basketball is the fastest growing team sport in Australia and in Western Australia. In terms of the total playing numbers, it sits 1.4% behind Australian rules football and is expected to overtake that particular primary sport in the next 5 years. However, as mentioned, additional growth has been hampered not only within our catchment region, but across the metropolitan area by significant court shortages. I'd like to quote here Fiona Notley, the Basketball WA Chair. Finding a home for the Perth Basketball Association is the #1 priority for Basketball WA in our strategic facilities plan. Their catchment area is one of the largest of any association, and Perth Basketball Association remains the only association without a home. Comparing PBA membership to the membership of similar basketball associations in Perth, many thousands of kids are not playing basketball in the inner metro region due to the lack of access to courts. If I could quickly just touch on the facility journey of the Perth Basketball Association. Back in 1977, there was a Project 77, our first documented search for a home for the Perth Redbacks. This was led by architect Richard Longley, who was the father of Luke Longley, who then went on to represent not only Australia, but the Perth Redbacks as his junior club in the NBA, and Len Vlahoff, father of Andrew Vlahoff. In 2021, we conducted a feasibility study in conjunction with Basketball WA and the Perth Reds Volleyball Association to quantify demand and supply. This feasibility study confirmed the urgent need for a 12-court indoor sports stadium. The study found that without action now, the local area covering most of the inner metropolitan region might never have suitable local indoor sporting facilities for the kids of the future to play in sporting competitions due to urban infill. This leads us now to Future Focus 2025, and thanks to the significant lobbying efforts by Basketball WA, we understand that infrastructure funding for indoor courts is a realistic landscape at the upcoming state election. With this in mind, and with fantastic support from both the Honourable Hannah Beasley MLA and the Honourable Jeff Baker MLA, the Perth Basketball Association, in conjunction with the Perth Reds Volleyball Association and other sporting stakeholders, started an e-petition being sponsored by the Honourable Hannah Beasley MLA to the lower house, calling on funding and land to be given to a 12-court indoor sporting stadium in Kensington. We currently are sitting at 5,700 signatures with approximately a month to go in that e-petition. The construction of a new stadium for Perth not only addresses the critical issues of a lack of indoor courts in the area, it has a secondary benefit of freeing up considerable piecemeal court space currently used by PBA across multiple venues. This brings the benefit of returning these spaces to other sporting and community activities, from gymnastics classes and yoga lessons to bingo and everything in between. Activities that are also crucial, they have a crucial need for this type of space. The petition calls on the government to act now and address this critical issue. Our vision is for a 12-court sporting and mixed-use stadium in Kensington that will not only provide the Perth Basketball Association its first home in its 60-year history, but will also provide a much-needed facility for many indoor sport clubs, schools and community groups in the area. This stadium will be the heartland of indoor sports across the metropolitan region. There are significant local benefits that such a stadium will bring to the city of South Perth. The benefits of sport in the wider community are well documented, but if I can just reiterate those, sport ensures that your local constituents can stay fit and healthy. It alleviates the effects of a sedentary lifestyle. It provides an outlet for marginalised and disaffected, particularly youth. And it provides a sense of community, something that in a modern day and age is a really important facet of a community. This proposed stadium, from a local perspective, will generate income via state, national and international competitions. It benefits the local business community. It attracts local and interstate visitors, and it will certainly reduce congestion in local community centres that are being flooded by basketballers, volleyballers and other sports, for usage of those community centres by other smaller activities and services. The reason that I am here today as part of this deputation is not to ask for money. It's not even to ask for land. It's to ask for your support and the community's raucous support for this current e-petition. Our city has been given a fantastic opportunity to stand together, united in support of a 12-court stadium right here in the heart of City of South Perth. The indoor court situation is critical. The time for action is now, and we believe that we can solve this together. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you very much for your deputation. Councillors, do we have any questions for Mr Lanigan this evening? Councillor Choi.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. Just one, and thank you, Mr Lanigan. I'm sorry we haven't had a chance to meet yet. I know we have been on email correspondence, I think, previously before you went away. But I'm just wondering, out of the 2,800 members or the active members that your club has, do you know how many of those are residents of the City of South Perth?
Yeah, from our most recent data, which is collected via a standardised system, about 34% of our playing population come from the City of South Perth.
Any further questions, councillors? No. Thank you very much for your deputation.
Thanks all, appreciate it.
I'd now like to invite Mr Anthony Mayo of South Perth, who is speaking for the notice of motion recommendation at item 12.1. Welcome, Mr Mayo. The microphone is yours and we look forward to your deputation.
Thank you, Mayor, councillors and city staff for the opportunity to provide this deputation in support of this motion. My name is Anthony Mayo, the President of the Perth Reds Volleyball Association. Perth Reds Volleyball Association, the Reds, is the largest indoor volleyball association in Western Australia and operates heavily in the City of South Perth. Reds is a sporting organisation born and bred here in South Perth. Reds Volleyball Club, one of two clubs under our association, was formed in 2018. 133 members were involved in 2018, with the club operating out of a single venue at Aquinas College in Salter Point. Since then, our association has grown to 1,028 members in 2023, with 2 affiliated clubs and operated programs across Perth in 19 different facilities, predominantly schools and Curtin University. The lack of indoor sporting facilities in the City of South Perth is pushing our non-for-profit association further and further away from our local area and creating significant challenges for our organisation. The lack of a suitably sized home facility has resulted in a satellite operation across an ever-growing list of venues that sees scenarios of our members coaching a team on a training night at one venue and then travelling up to 20 minutes to train for the team they play in. Teams often train for a reduced period of time and or reduced frequency each week in order to squeeze in all of our teams across the venues that we operate out of. Our staff and administrative team operate daily out of cafes and restaurants that include Ratchino, Henry M's and the Mount Henry Tavern, while our equipment is stored in the garages and cars of our volunteers due to a lack of storage space. Sporting clubs cannot continue to sustainably operate in this manner, particularly ones of our size, and compared to many other local sporting organisations who have suitable access to club rooms and home facilities, our organisation does not have such access. Because of these challenges, our association is strongly supporting the e-petition launched by the Perth Basketball Association, who we have worked closely with since March 2021, to advocate the need for a home for our organisations. A 12-court indoor stadium and 4 beach volleyball court facility that will become the home of Redbacks and Reds will not only unite our sporting associations under one roof, but would create sensational opportunities for our local South Perth community. Sport is a core building block for a vibrant and connected community. At grassroots level, community sport is the mechanism for local residents to play, stay fit and healthy, and build connections. Residents of all ages in our local area benefit from the physical, social and mental health benefits of participating in sporting activities. The projected population increases in the city and surrounding areas means that it is vital for South Perth to have the facilities needed for locals and visitors across WA to play indoor sport in our area. This facility would create possibilities for state, national and international competitions and events to be hosted here in the City of South Perth. This would provide significant benefit for families and residents, local businesses and the city. It would attract visitors from across Perth, around WA, interstate and overseas to our city, while offering fantastic opportunities for other community groups, local primary and secondary schools and Curtin University. Our city has been given a fantastic opportunity to stand together, united in support of a new 12-court indoor stadium right here in the heart of South Perth. Our proposal does not currently rely on any funding or land to be provided by the city, and this marks an incredible opportunity for our community to enjoy future benefits of investment that is being sought from state and federal government. Our campaign is attracting wide-ranging support and interest from across the WA sporting public and our volleyball community here in WA and across the country. We're also very grateful for the support provided by our patrons in the Member for South Perth, Jeff Baker MLA, and Minister for Local Government and Youth and Member for Victoria Park, Hannah Beasley MLA. In closing, it is vitally important for our city that all sporting clubs have the chance to grow, thrive and provide locals the chance to access a mixed-use indoor facility and play indoor sport in places close to home. There is a well-identified and critical need for indoor sporting clubs like Reds and Redbacks to be granted this opportunity to grow. And without a new 12-court indoor stadium in Kensington, our organisations will be continually faced with significant facility, administrative and logistical challenges in operating in our local area here in the city of South Perth, to the point where local indoor clubs may be lost or have their presence diminished. Our Perth Reds board is incredibly pleased to see this motion brought to council, as are our affiliated clubs, and we hope that there can be strong support for this motion. The time for unity is now, the time for investment is now, and the time to make this happen is now. We encourage everyone here tonight and the wider City of South Perth community to sign and share this e-petition, and together we can build a new 12-court stadium for Perth. Thank you.
Thank you for your deputation, Mr Mayo. Councillors, any questions for Mr Mayo this evening? No. Thank you very much for your deputation. Okay. I'd now like to invite Ms Bronwyn David of South Perth back. She is speaking against the notice of motion recommendation at item 12.3. Welcome again to you, Ms David. The microphone is yours and we look forward to your deputation.
Thank you, and I understand there's a PowerPoint presentation for this one as well. You're good to go. Thank you. Okay. Good evening again. Thank you for this opportunity. I'll only be addressing the aspect of the motion regarding the proposal to delay verge planting, as I understand the issue with consulting residents about the planned removal of some street trees is being addressed separately. Well, the fact is that it's getting hot out there, and the planet has had its warmest June on record. It was the 13th consecutive month that a global heat record was set. And as we well know, heat kills. We're just going to flip through. Come on, here we go. Some headlines that I've gathered. About the deadly effects of extreme heat. Heat-related deaths in Perth could rise almost 60% by 2050 if temperatures keep rising. Northern parts of Australia to suffer from lethal heat in coming decades. And as you can see, this is from a variety of news sources, not just, lefty ones like The Guardian. This is from news. Here's one from Fox. Killer heat, deaths mounting during record hot summer across the West. A horrible way to die, how extreme heat is killing Italian workers. In addition to killing people, the heat's putting people off having children. Here's a story about how the threat posed by climate change is another factor, especially for those aged under 30. The Sydney University study found that 43% of 18 to 30-year-olds said climate change has a great deal or fair amount of influence on how many children they plan to have. Trees can moderate the local climate and reduce temperatures. Verges are one of the few spaces where the city can contribute trees to our environment, and it does an amazing job of contributing trees to our suburbs. In fact, it's the only body that's wholesale contributing new trees into our environment. But thanks to the rapidly warming climate, there's only a very short window to plant. That window is open now. Any delay to the planting program will mean that the window may be missed and another year will pass before trees get in the ground, another year of record temperatures. The city over the last few years has had 2 de facto referendums on trees. The survey about tree protection provisions in local planning scheme number 7, and recently the survey about the tree protection policy. Both surveys had an overwhelming number of positive results. South Perth people like and want trees by a majority of 2 to 1. There will always be individuals who object to trees, but the point of having an authority to manage public assets like verges and street trees is to demonstrate best practice, to be the grown-up in the room, to do what is right even when it's hard. Please reject any proposal that will slow the deployment of verge trees. Thank you.
Thank you for your deputation, Ms David. Councillors, do we have any questions for Ms David this evening? No. Thank you for your deputation. I'd now like to invite Professor, I hope I pronounced this right, Skyska Stevens of Como, who is speaking against the notice of motion recommendation at item 12.3. Do we have Professor Stevens with us this evening? We do not. Okay. In that case, I'd like to invite Ms Kathy Lees of South Perth, who is speaking against the notice of motion recommendation at item 12.3. Welcome back, Ms Lees. The microphone is yours and we look forward to your deputation.
So I have a PowerPoint as well for this one. Just work out how to use the clicker since I had an assistant last time. So good evening again, Mayor, councillors and city officers. I am speaking now against the notice of motion titled Community Consultation for Tree Planting and Tree Removals. So the motion calls for the proposed removal of old trees and the planting of new street trees across the city of South Perth to be immediately paused. I've assumed that the reference to removal of old trees is referring to the large number of olive trees in Carrawarra the city is proposing to remove and replace with native trees. And a stop to the removal of these healthy olive trees and community engagement on a better way forward is absolutely supported. So that part of the motion I don't have a problem with. South Perth Tree Canopy advocates support the retention of healthy trees, as you know, unless there's a very good reason for their removal. But a stop to the planting of new trees, street trees, on empty verges is absolutely not supported. We are talking about 590 new street trees funded by state government urban greening grant of $77,000 awarded by the WA Local Government Association to the city. It is understood that over 700 letters were sent out in late June by the city advising landowners of the proposed planting, and that around 10 landowners with empty verges adjoining their properties have subsequently objected. So if my maths is right, this is less than a 1.5% objection rate. The grant required the trees to be planted in areas of canopy colour below 10% and with significant urban heat island issues because, as we know, trees have a significant cooling effect as a consequence of transpiration and shade. And similar to Bronwyn's slide, this shows you a treed street, 33.7 degrees, same day, no trees, 48.7 degrees. I mean, the evidence is there. And this is a similar one to the one that Bronwyn provided as well, showing the massive difference in the temperature in a street and around people's homes if you have trees versus no trees. The streets where the trees are to be planted are in Waterford, Signia Cove and Carrawarra. Sadly, these streets all meet the criteria set by the Urban Greening Grant of low canopy and high heat. They are the streets in the city that most urgently need street trees. And I've got some mapping here. So this is the Waterford area where the street trees are to be planted. And you can see here, this is the canopy cover that's existing. So the dark brown areas are less than 5% canopy cover. And the slightly darker or slightly lighter areas are 5 to 10% canopy cover. And then if you have a look at the next slide shows the urban heat island index in those streets. So in the darkest red areas, the urban heat index is +7 degrees. So just for reference, the urban heat island index is an estimate of the additional heat that local land use factors contribute to urban areas. So for example, on a 40-degree day in Perth, if the UHI in Waterford is 7, as it is in some of those streets, then the Waterford residents would be experiencing temperatures of at least 47 degrees. That's really scary. Similarly, for Signia Cove, where the trees are intended to go, look at that. We're talking less than 5% in all that dark brown. That is just not acceptable with the climate change that we're experiencing. And then if you look at the urban heat island index, same thing, +7 degrees over the majority of the streets there. I haven't got the slides for Carrawarra because I thought I was going to run out of time. So, but the same applies there. It's the same story. So the motion not only proposes that trees not be planted if an adjoining landowner objects, it proposes that trees not be planted if no response is received. So that presumption is against rather in favour of street trees. Presentation of the community consultation that is proposed in the notice of motion to the council will realistically take until the end of September. Now, it's understood that the 590 trees are ready to go and that they need to get planted before the end of August to have the optimum opportunity to get established and survive through the next summer, but also to meet the requirements of the grant. So the community consultation is just not going to work if we want to get these trees in the ground. So if we don't get them in the ground before the end of August, the $77,000 will need to be returned to the state government. Presumably the cost of the 590 trees that are ready to go will be borne by ratepayers. And on top of this, there will be reputational implications for the city with access to future grants being put at jeopardy. The rationale to support the motion provided in the agenda indicates that trees should not be planted on verges if people don't want them for reasons such as solar panel access, gutters, pruning, parking, driveways, etc. There's also mention of views in the notice of motion. To be clear, street verges are public land that belong to all of us. They belong to the community. They are not the asset of the adjoining landowner. And street trees are valuable community assets. As indicated in my earlier deputation, in 2006, it was estimated that each street tree contributes to wellness with about $117,000 benefit over its lifespan. And now in 2024, this will be significantly higher. Street trees provide multiple benefits to the community, not least of which being the shade, the critical shade and the cooling of our streets and our homes as climate change ramps up, as demonstrated in the earlier slides. And of course, they enhance the aesthetics of a street for everyone in the street, which in turn adds significant dollar value to the homes. And in 2013, research showed that large street trees generated an enhanced economic value to residential properties of around $17,000. And again, this will be significantly higher now. So the reasons for opposing the street tree, that the gutters, etc., are just not valid. Street trees are likely to have negligible impact on solar panels on a house and negligible impact on gutters on a house. Pruning of street trees is the responsibility of the city, not the landowner. The uses of verges for parking is not a priority. And there are standards to ensure that street trees are not planted where they would restrict driveway access. The planting of these street trees in Waterford, Signia Cove and Carrawarra is urgent as our summers get longer, hotter and drier. Every year that we delay, the survival rate of the young trees planted reduces. And of course, they take a number of decades to grow significant canopy. So rather than allowing landowners to opt out of having a street tree, many councils are now mandating
60 seconds, Ms Lees.
Street tree provision on all verges where trees can be physically and practically accommodated, as they recognise how essential they are in a warming climate. And this is what SPTCA advocated for early this year. So approval of the notice of motion as it stands and requiring the explicit consent of a single landowner to a tree on a public land would be a huge backward step for the city. It not only puts this year's planting in jeopardy, it puts future planting across the whole of the local government area in jeopardy. And it is unbelievable that it is being suggested, given the canopy crisis and the climate change impacts that we are facing. Thank you.
Thank you for your deputation, Ms Lees. Councillors, any questions for Ms Lees this evening? No. Thank you for your deputation. Okay, I'd now like to invite Mr Colin Lee of Carrawarra, who is speaking for the notice of motion recommendation at item 12.3. Welcome to you, Mr Lee. Do we have Mr Lee with us this evening? We do not. Okay. In that case, I'd like to invite Dr Natasha Hurley-Walker of Carrawarra, who is speaking against the notice of motion recommendation at item 12.3. Welcome, Dr Hurley-Walker. The microphone is yours and we look forward to your deputation.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you to the councillors and city staff for letting me speak tonight. Yes, I'm Dr Natasha Hurley-Walker. I've been a resident of Carrawarra since 2019. Maybe you've heard my name in connection with an event I ran last year for the community, which was in partnership with City of South Perth, Befriend, and People Helping People around the solar eclipse. So I'm an astrophysicist working at Curtin University, and as a physicist, I am very aware of the challenges that climate change is bringing to our planet and to our city. So I am speaking here tonight to oppose the motion about the consultation regarding the removal and planting of trees in Carrawarra and surrounds, but my stance is more nuanced than a simple opposal. So I would like to explain that largely in regard to the removal of the trees. So in early July, my family received a letter which was dated 21st of June from the city, saying that all the mature olive trees in our suburb would be removed and replaced with native saplings, and that the work would commence in late June. So we received the letter after the work was supposed to commence. There was no explanation of whether we could discuss the removal, only a phone number to call if we had concerns about the health of a tree, and a threat of law enforcement action if we as residents were to interfere with our verge trees. Now, on our street, Wannell Way, our house is north facing, and we have the two largest trees on the street, which are olive trees. All along us are empty verges, essentially. As the SPTCA advocate said, our area does have a lack of tree canopy. So I found out through further inquiries with the city that 120 trees would be removed, and most of these are up to 25 years old, so they were placed when the suburb was built. So I was not very happy with this. I wrote a written complaint to the city, as did my husband, but I wanted to understand the impact of this on our community. So on Sunday, Councillor Brenda Brandis and I and two advocates from the SPTCA went door knocking, and we canvassed the opinion in the local community. And I have to say, I expected people to complain about the olive trees. I had been told by the city that there had been complaints. So I thought that we would receive, maybe most people saying, actually, I'm fine, get rid of the trees. But of the 45 houses that there were residents home and we could speak to, we had 37 residents say that they would prefer to retain their trees. So that's about 80%. People were very surprised about the planned removal of the mature trees. They talked about the shade that the trees bring, the fact that they see wildlife eating the olives, the fact that generally the trees bring an aesthetic value to the suburb. And I spoke to a couple of the residents who had been there since the suburb was built, and a couple of them have come to support me today, because they described the area when they moved in as a moonscape, and that they had watched these saplings, 100 trees, grow over the last 25 years to be a few meters in height, and that it would be really, really sad to reset that back to zero, especially as our summers get hotter. I'd also like to point out that these trees are of community benefit. So at least last year, I partook in an olive pick where lots of us went round and we picked the olives and we pressed them. And we generated hundreds of litres of olive oil for the community. And my whole pantry is full of olives, as are many other residents. They are a real community resource that bring the community together. A lot of people spontaneously, without me or the councillor suggesting it, expressed surprise that the best way to increase canopy cover would be to remove trees. That seemed extremely counterintuitive. I'm not an urban forestry expert, I'm an astrophysicist, but I did some research and it seems that the best practice in urban forestry is indeed infill. So you bring in new trees and then as those mature, once they're at a certain height, it's suitable potentially to remove non-native trees and replace them at that time. To remove all of the trees at once and then replace them with saplings is going to most likely result in the death of most of those saplings, and that would be counter to the goals of the urban greening program. This is also counter to the City of South Perth's own urban forest strategy, which states for Carrawara that the main thing we can do is retain our existing trees. That's what all private homeowners are encouraged to do. And the City of South Perth Street Tree Management Plan, which states that only trees that are diseased, dying, or hazardous in some way, or interfering with public works such as sewerage, have grounds for removal. Cost of maintenance is not a criterion for removal, and yet that was the only criterion given to residents in the letter that we received. So the city is acting against its own street tree management and urban forestry plans, which are available for residents to read on their website. Another point in the street tree management plan is that we, as residents, should be given 7 days to give feedback on the planned removal of any tree. The letter that we received did not ask us for our feedback or for any kind of discussion. As I say, we're only given a phone number to report on the health of a tree. So many of the residents that I spoke to felt very disenfranchised and disappointed by this, like our voices don't matter because we live in Carrawara. And I would like to point out that that's quite in contrast to the way that the residents of Mill Point were treated when they had the impact of the urban forestry scheme and were given many months of consultation and a chance to have their voices heard. So this was unnecessarily disenfranchising for the residents of Carrawara. In general, though, everyone I spoke to very strongly in favour of the urban greening program. Everybody likes trees, essentially. We only had a handful of residents say, I don't like leaves or I don't like birds, neither of which are particularly good reasons to halt the planting. Everybody noted that removing the trees would actually increase the heat in the suburb for the next 10 years, and that seems counter to good planning and could even result in health hazards, as evinced by the SPCTA members in their last couple of presentations. I'd also like to note that none of the olive trees actually suffered or were damaged or dried or died. Even during our recent very hot summer, all of the olive trees were really, really robust. So it seems a little bit unwise to remove trees that are surviving increasingly hot summers. So I would like to encourage the city to continue the planting, please. Some residents did express concern that the planting might harm their reticulation. So please do this in consultation and discussion with residents, but please do go ahead and plant those trees. The residents that we spoke to and my family, we're all very much in favour. Other things the city could consider doing would be to reduce the amount of pruning so that the trees can actually grow to their full canopy cover and height. At the moment they are very rigorously pruned back, so they actually are much shorter and smaller than they otherwise would be. And again, that would help with the urban greening program and reduce heat in the suburb. So the reason that I oppose this motion is that this motion will be advanced on the 23rd of July, which is the next council meeting. The trees are scheduled to be removed on the 22nd of July. So if we have this motion, with all due respect to Councillor De Souza, what will happen is our trees will be removed and then there will be an endless consultation before new trees are planted. And we will go from the little canopy cover that we have to no canopy whatsoever. So I'm really pleading with you to halt the removal of the mature trees as they stand now, and please go ahead with the planting if you have any power to affect the motions of the city. That's really my statement, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your deputation. Councillors, do we have any questions for Dr. Hurley Walker this evening? No. Thank you very much for your deputation. Now, it's almost 7:30. We've polished off the deputations there. I might call a 5-minute adjournment before we move on to item 10, just to give people a chance to stretch their legs and use the facilities if need be. I'll see you all back here at 7:31. right, folks, we'll reconvene now. We're turning now to item 10 of the agenda, which is the draft July reports. And I'll now hand you over to the Chief Executive Officer, Mr. Mike Bradford, to take you through the balance of the draft July reports.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Item 10.1.1, co-located hockey facilities within the City of South Perth. This report presents the discussion with Wesley South Perth Hockey Club, WASPs, and Hockey WA in respect of how WASPs needs can be best met through the Australian High Performance Hockey Centre. Council previously considered the matter at its meeting held on the 27th of February this year and resolved for a further report to be presented by July 2024 on the outcome of those discussions.
Thank you, Mr. Bradford. Councillors, any questions on this item? Councillor Choi.
Yes, thanks, Mr. Mayor. I understand the Wesley South Perth Hockey Club have received a lease document from the City over a portion of Collier Reserve for their relocation efforts, and can elected members please receive a copy of this on the hub for our own information?
Mr. Adams.
We've sent them a draft, so it's the first draft of a lease and an option. So they're currently reviewing it, and they've got their solicitors reviewing it. We actually met with them today. So they'll send us back a marked up copy. Once we've finalised it, then council will be provided with a copy of it finalised. We don't normally provide working copies to council, but it probably is an opportune time to let council know that we won't have a finalised copy ready to go to the August 2020 council meeting. So I'll issue a notice to council letting you know that it's more than likely that that report will be delayed to the September meeting, because they're relying on their solicitors to provide comment back on the lease and the option to them. And so until we get their markups back and know exactly what they're requesting, then we won't know what negotiations still need to take place. So given that our time frame for getting the reports done for the August meeting is probably about 2 weeks away, we're probably not going to meet that time frame. So I'll just have to, more than likely it'll be September before that comes back.
Thank you, Mr. Adams. Any further questions on this item, councillors? Councillor Brenda Abrandis.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Can the administration please confirm whether there's been an update with regard to the capital funding for the WASPs to exercise the opinion? Has there been any updated that's been provided to the city at all on the funding requirements?
Ms. Shaw, should I send that? No, Mr. Adams.
No.
Okay. Any further questions, Councillor Brenda Abrandis?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I've actually got a few questions on this item. So just with regard to the drafting of the lease now, so I understand that's being worked on, but given that we've got a couple of matters that require further consideration, including further consideration with the Hockey WA Australian High Performance Hockey Centre, and also securing the capital funding, would it be appropriate to incur those sort of costs and that sort of time to prepare the lease at this point in time?
Mr. Bradford?
We're responding to the two council resolutions. One is this report, and the other one is around the granting of the option and lease.
Okay. Thank you. My next question is with regard to, so with reference to the city's 9th of May 2024 request of Hockey WA for further information, it noted that the WASPs advised their position on the matter remains unchanged in that they continue to seek a suitable location for co-located hockey facilities. So it includes synthetic turf, grass turf and the association club facilities. From my understanding, on the 29th of July meeting with Hockey WA, it was clear that the proposal was suitable for co-located hockey facilities for the WASPs. So that actually included synthetic turf, grass and also club facilities. So can the administration just please confirm if the co-located hockey facility proposal contains those facilities that would be suitable for the WASPs?
I think I'll try and clarify what I think you're suggesting. So, the High Performance Hockey Centre at Curtin will include community facilities, an indoor facility, club rooms to be shared, and 4 hockey turfs. It does not include grass fields. And so WASP's needs, as stated by WASPs, are to have a single facility that combines a clubhouse, grass hockey fields and a turf. And that cannot be met in that form at the Perth High Performance Hockey Centre.
Any further questions, Councillor Brenda Brandis? No, okay. Councillors, Councillor Navard.
Just the one, thank you, Mayor Milner. Could fundraising be considered an important justification in WASP's claim for long-term permanent occupancy of Collier Reserve?
Ms Shaw, should I send that your way?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Fundraising is something we can consider, but that more comes down to the club itself and the funding required to demonstrate that it's met the obligations for the option to lease itself. So in terms of whether the city considers that they're financially viable, we would likely need to see some further detailed financial information to make sure we can ensure that the asset could be sustained longer term. But fundraising would be an option for WASP in terms of generating income to otherwise support that information when they provide that to the city, which is a requirement of the option to lease.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillors, any further questions on this item? No. Next item, please, Mr Bradford.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. Item 10.3.1, Draft Local Planning Policy, Tree Retention for final adoption. The purpose of this report is for Council to consider adopting a draft amended local planning policy, tree retention, following advertising.
Thank you, Mr Bradford. Councillors, does anyone have any? Councillor Choi.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Got a number of questions which were provided on notice. I'm not going to be asking all of them, just pulled out the ones that I will be asking tonight. The first one is, who will have to pay for any arborist or structural engineering report the city deems as necessary in investigating and enforcing the new local planning policy, and what is the estimated cost of such reports, please?
Ms Shaw.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. So it would be the responsibility of the landowner or the applicant to provide any necessary information in support of an application. So that includes the arborist report or any sort of structural engineering report that's otherwise required. The cost of those reports is typically around $600 to $1,000 each, but it depends on the complexity and the amount of trees that are included in the application, and would of course be up to the individual consultant themselves.
Thank you through the chair to Director Shaw. Now I just want to make sure I've got something that I've read in the report correct. So in relation to liability and safety issues as outlined in the report on page 16 of the agenda, if my neighbour, for example, has a very large tree, likely to constitute a regulated tree under this draft policy, and it is situated in the corner of their backyard overhanging all other boundary properties, with branches that regularly drop foliage into mine and others' yards, including into swimming pools and roof gutters, we and other affected neighbours would all be required to complete and submit a development application to the city seeking permission to prune back those branches to the fence line, together with covering the cost of any arborist and or structural engineer's report the city may deem as necessary to make a determination. Is that correct? Have I got that right?
Ms Shaw.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. If the tree was a regulated tree, then that would be correct, unless the maintenance pruning that was being undertaken otherwise met the requirements of maintenance pruning as defined in the policy, which would make it exempt. So effectively, if the tree itself, first of all, was a regulated tree and the extent of the pruning was greater than what was otherwise provided in the exemptions in the policy, then they would need to submit a development application.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillor Choi, your next question.
Thank you for that clarification through the chair to Director Shaw again. Is the city aware that another local government has recently repealed their tree retention planning policy just a year after it was implemented? And are there any lessons that can be learnt from their failed policy for this local government's draft policy before it is endorsed?
Ms Shaw.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I'm assuming you're referring to the City of Kalamunda. The City of Kalamunda's policy was slightly different to the draft policy presented on tonight's agenda. Their policy referred to retrospective applications in the first instance, and they also had native clearing provisions included in that draft policy. So it was different to what's been drafted here. The Kalamunda policy sought to define tree removal as earthworks for the purposes of the Planning and Development Act, whereas this policy is seeking to provide tree removal as works for the purposes of the definition, which is slightly different.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillor Choi.
Yes, thank you through the chair again to Director Shaw. How does the state's new urban greening strategy and urban greening grant program, of which South Perth is a current recipient, relate to tree retention objectives as set out in the policy?
Ms Shaw.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. This policy deals with tree retention only and not tree planting provisions. If council was seeking to include tree planting provisions in the policy would need the approval of the West Australian Planning Commission because it would otherwise vary requirements of the residential design codes in respect to tree planting.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillor Choi.
Oh yes, thank you, Mr Mayor. Again through to Director Shaw. How long does the city anticipate the application of this local planning policy needs to be suspended, if approved, for the city to obtain the relevant detailed data for all trees on private property?
Ms Shaw.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. So the city received its latest data in April this year and has updated the data set. But that data relates to the height of the trees only and not the diameter of the trees. So we would need additional information to capture all of the data required to otherwise enforce the policy. For the city to receive data with respect to the diameter, I would expect that we could undertake that within the next 3 months, and that would include the time taken to undertake the flyover, updating the user interface and all of the data sets that we have. However, in terms of overall canopy data moving forward, arbor carbon typically only flies over in summer, and they typically only fly once a year. And so whilst we would have some data over the next 3 months to otherwise enforce the policy, to get a complete picture, it's likely that we would need to wait until next summer. So we are capable of enforcing the policy provisions once we have that diameter information. However, we would need a longer period of time. The reason that arbor carbon typically only flies over in summer is because obviously there are deciduous trees and they have no leaves at the moment, so we need to wait.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillor Choi.
Yes, thank you. My last question through to Director Shaw again. How will the city practically keep abreast of the detailed tree mapping required at regular intervals in order to enable consistent and equitable enforcement of reported tree damaging activity across the district?
Ms Shaw.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I mean, I think that flyover once a year would be enough to capture the information that we need. And the reason being is because the data from the flyovers itself is simply the starting point to identify trees that may otherwise be considered a regulated tree. The data set itself provides some degree of accuracy in terms of the height and the canopy and the diameter, etc. However, in order to meet the requirements for a successful prosecution, it's likely that we would need to ground truth these trees anyway. So even though we would have the information available in that respect, in terms of the data needed for a prosecution, we would go out on site and actually have a look. So this information would otherwise help the city identify where the canopy trees actually are for the purposes of identifying them to uphold the requirements of the policy, but we would need to go into further detail on the ground to make sure we met the requirements in terms of enforcement action.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillor Choi.
Thank you for your indulgence. Just a follow-on as part of that question to Director Shaw, which is what would be the approximate cost each time that the city has to do that?
Ms Shaw.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. So when we first received quotes, and I think I reported it back to council last time, it was approximately $12,000. For us to update the individual user interface for each of the data sets, so for example, just the diameter, we'd be looking at between $5,000 and $10,000 for that. For the complete annual flyover, you're looking at between $30,000 and $40,000.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Any further questions, Councillor Choi? No. Councillors, Councillor Navard?
Yes, I just have one question here. Why have palm trees been deemed not worth preserving in the proposed local planning policy?
Ms Shaw?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. So you can see from the criteria for a regulated tree, it's really targeted at the canopy trees and the mature trees. We received a submission that questioned why trees such as palm trees would otherwise be included, given they don't usually provide that level of canopy cover. And in response to the submission, we've inserted that provision to make them exempt.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillors, any further questions on this item? Councillor Cridland.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Probably to Director Shaw. Had three questions. First one was a bit selfish. I found some citrus gall wasp in one of my citrus at home, and I spent the weekend chopping out the galls. I have some large citrus trees. It seems to me when I have a look at maintenance pruning that I would be committing an offence if I was to chop out the galls, the timber with the galls from my large citrus trees, because it's not dead or diseased wood. Has that been taken into account in preparation of the policy?
Ms Shaw?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I think the intent of the definition of maintenance pruning at sea, where it includes is of a fruit tree and done for fruit production, was intended to cover that requirement. But again, I don't think the city would undertake prosecution action for pruning of a fruit tree in that manner.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillor Cridland?
The WAPC has been a bit unfriendly to the city over the years, and it's removed similar provisions to these from the local government, local planning schemes in Netherlands and for us here in South Perth. Have they ever given a set of reasons for why they did that?
Ms Shaw?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I mean, I can't speak on behalf of the WAPC, but my understanding is that the reason they removed provisions from local planning schemes is because the state government has a certain position in respect to encroachment of provisions on private property rights, and also the potential implications with respect to infill development occurring. And my understanding is that the position is that they're not seeking to introduce any further legislative or statutory requirements that may otherwise limit the ability to develop parcels of land for housing.
Thank you, Ms Shaw.
And my final question is, I did hear the question from Councillor Choi, and I'm not sure if this relates to her question or not, but have any other local governments gone down the path of, and I'm talking here in Perth, of having a similar sort of tree retention policy? And has that worked? Has it not worked? Is there anything we can learn from that?
Ms Shaw?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. There are probably two parts to that. Some local governments already have local planning policies that relate to the planting and provision of trees on private property. And the only way they are seeking to retain trees on private property is to otherwise offset the amount of trees that otherwise are required to be planted where they retain an existing mature tree. But there is no statutory head of power that would otherwise enable the retention of those trees on private property. So this policy, by establishing tree removal as works for the purposes of the definition of development under the Planning and Development Act, would be the first of its kind if adopted by Council.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillors, any other questions on this item this evening? Councillor D'Souza.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. My first question is how many trees are there in the city of South Perth which would qualify as defined as a regulated tree?
Ms Shaw?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. The city doesn't have that information, and the reason being is that whilst we have data related to the height limits contained within that existing data aren't calibrated to what's otherwise required in the policy, which is why if council adopted this policy, we've recommended that we first obtain the necessary data to ensure that we have an appreciation of how many trees are likely to meet the definition of a regulated tree.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillor D'Souza.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. And in terms of that data, is it basically essentially height and diameter, or like what further data would be required to get that clarity on the definition?
Ms Shaw.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. So it's effectively what's included in the definition of a regulated tree. So you can see in the draft policy that it has a height of 8 metres, or at least 8 metres, average canopy diameter of at least 6 metres, trunk circumference of at least 1.5, measured above 1.4 metres, and it's a species that's not on a state or local weed register. So whilst we have some height information, we would require further information in respect to the canopy diameter and the circumference of the tree itself.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillor D'Souza.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. And in terms of the detailed mapping, is there any estimation on how much this mapping would cost the city?
Ms Shaw.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I think I answered that one earlier. So the flyovers, we're looking at between $30,000 and $40,000 annually.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillor D'Souza.
Final question, Mr Mayor. So is that the intent to conduct these annually or every 6 months in terms of to obviously trees grow over time?
Ms Shaw.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I think annually would be appropriate given the rate at which trees that would otherwise meet this criteria would typically grow, and given the availability of arbor cover to actually undertake that flyover.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. I might ask a couple of questions. How much, let's say that we think one of our residents has breached this policy. How much would a prosecution of one of our residents cost the city on average, ballpark figures?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Typically between $10,000 to $20,000 per prosecution, I would suggest.
Thank you. And what penalties could a resident suffer following a successful prosecution?
Thank you. So the maximum penalty under the Planning and Development Act for an individual is $200,000. For a corporation, it's up to $1 million. Ongoing offences is $25,000 per day.
Thank you. Would the city be able to recover its costs from the resident following a successful prosecution against a resident that breached the policy?
Thank you. If it was the Magistrates Court, potentially. If it was a case that an application was received and the city refused the application, and there was an application for review to the State Administrative Tribunal, the SAT doesn't work on the basis of costs per se. It's meant to be a tribunal for mediation in the first instance, so it's unlikely that the city would be able to make a claim for costs unless the applicant had been vexatious in any way.
Thank you. Councillors, any further questions for the administration? Councillor Coveney.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. How many city officers would we need to employ if there were, say, 10 prosecutions each calendar year?
Ms Shaw.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I think it really depends on the evidence that we have. So to give you some context, the city currently has one development compliance officer. And that officer addresses all areas of planning compliance. So that can include things like a childcare centre and whether it's complying with its conditions of development approval, illegal development works. So we would need additional officers, I would say, to be able to undertake the initial investigation to gather the evidence that's otherwise required to put the city in the best position for a successful prosecution.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Coveney.
Further questions? I've got about 7 more questions. I'm sorry for the pestering. What would that cost the city in terms of having a few extra officers in terms of wages, super and other costs?
Ms Shaw.
So we could use development compliance officers or planning officers to undertake the investigation. A planning officer is typically around $85,000 to $90,000 plus overheads, similar to a development compliance officer. So I would say around $100,000 an officer.
Ms Shaw?
I think we have around 22,000 properties, so it depends how many are undertaking maintenance pruning and the like, but I would say there could be hundreds of applications.
Thank you. Councillor Coveney?
And how many new city officers would we need to employ to look at, say, for instance, 100 development applications each year?
Ms Shaw?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I think it depends on the complexity of the application itself. If it was for minor maintenance pruning, I would assume it could be dealt with quite quickly. If there needed to be a full assessment in terms of the review of the arborist report itself, and if there was any consultation with neighbouring property owners, we would probably need more. But I would say probably at least 2 to 3 planning officers for the assessment of applications. I would just also add as well, we would actually, should council adopt the policy, we would need to monitor that, and we would look at the number of applications that are coming in, and if there was a requirement for additional resources, we would be requesting that as part of workforce planning and as part of the budget process.
Thank you. So am I correct in understanding, Director Shaw, that if, say, we had 3 new officers, that's $300,000 potentially we've got on our books in wages?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Yes, that's right.
Thank you. Page 12 of the officer report says that adopting this policy carries a likelihood of trees being preemptively removed at scale ahead of the policy coming into effect. The officer report goes on to say that a broad community advertising campaign is necessary. What would that broad campaign cost?
Ms Shaw?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. So we actually did have a look into this, and apologies for not including this in the financial implications section of the report. So if we were to send a letter to every single property within the district, and granted there would be less than the 21,000 because some are obviously apartments and don't have any trees on the property, would be looking at around $45,000. We would then include probably a few extra thousand on top of that in terms of the graphic design and comms, etc., associated with that type of campaign. But I think it would likely be in council's best interest if it did adopt the policy to make sure that every single landowner in the district that's otherwise affected did receive written notification instead of just relying on our social media posts and the like, to make sure that we are not, to make sure everybody's aware of the requirements of the policy.
Thank you. I believe you'd just said to Councillor Choi that it's about $600 to $1,000 per application for mums and dads to make it, that make them themselves. How long would it take to process each of those applications?
So it would be treated as if it's a development application. So under our planning regulations, we have a statutory timeframe of 60 days. Depending on the nature of the application though, and to make sure that the city was not negligent in terms of any potential damage caused by an application to otherwise maintain a tree for safety reasons, we would be seeking to expedite our assessment and determination of any application that came in accordance with the policy requirements.
Thank you. And final question. Presuming the city is going to largely become aware of non-compliance by residents stopping each other in, and presuming that that neighbour would then need evidence of the non-compliance, is it a fair assumption to say that this could result in bad neighbourly relations or people taking photos and videos of each other?
Ms Shaw?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I think that is a possibility, and I know at the last local government that I worked for, unfortunately, that was the case with tree preservation orders. However, it did still provide the statutory mechanism to otherwise protect the tree.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. And I guess I might... Oh, Councillor Choi?
Yeah, thanks, Mr Mayor. I'm just wondering, going back to the maintenance part of the policy, what would be the implications of removing maintenance of trees by way of pruning overhanging vegetation onto neighbouring properties removing that from the policy, would there be any implications to that in terms of the overall objectives?
Ms Shaw?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So in terms of why the maintenance pruning was included and why it specified that it was only intended to be once every calendar year, the reason for that was to stop landowners potentially incrementally cutting trees to the extent that the tree would then die and otherwise would then need to be removed. So the intent was to try and provide some parameters around what would be acceptable to ensure the ongoing maintenance of the tree, whilst not providing an avenue for landowners to incrementally cut and kill the tree. However, I think in terms of, from a practical point of view, whether it would be okay to remove maintenance pruning, I don't see that there would necessarily be an issue with that, on the basis that the majority of landowners typically undertake maintenance pruning to trees without the intention of removing the tree itself.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillor Prenderville, I saw your hand go up there.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I've just had a question around enforcement. Has the city obtained any advice as to the possible success of this type of prosecution, and are there any other options for prosecution, such as a local government issued fine system?
Ms Shaw?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So in terms of whether or not it would be a successful prosecution, we haven't received any advice on that because they're considered on a case-by-case basis. We know what type of evidence we would otherwise need to have, and that's typically photographic evidence, witness statements, contemporaneous notes and the like, to otherwise provide sufficient evidence to prove that there was an offence committed in accordance with the policy. In terms of the other penalties potentially available, the Planning and Development Act also provides for planning infringement notices, which is $500. However, similar to parking fines, if the landowner then effectively appealed that to the Magistrates Court and it was upheld or the like, it would go down the prosecution path anyway. So there is an avenue to try and bring that into compliance, but as you can imagine, if somebody is cutting a tree down, would $500 be a sufficient deterrent when it would otherwise provide for a clear site in which to develop? Which is why I think typically you would go down the full prosecution path in accordance with the enforcement provisions of the Act.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillor Navard?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. How will people know if they own a regulated tree or if their neighbour owns a regulated tree? Thank you.
Ms Shaw?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And this is where the broad community campaign would need to come into it. So it's very clear to the community what tree constitutes a regulated tree. We would make any data set that we had like that publicly available to enable landowners to undertake some sort of self-assessment, and they could see, well, I think it might meet the criteria. I can have a look at what data the city has available. And like I said, they could otherwise ground truth the tree themselves, or if they thought that it may be an issue, we could always review it to see whether or not it met the criteria. We often provide written planning advice for different matters related to planning policies, and that would be the same.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillor Choi?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Look, I understand there's quite a few investment properties in the area and quite a few vacant properties, and there are a lot of tenanted properties. And I'm just wondering how, and there's managing agents also that look after tenanted properties. I'm just wondering if, I understand the residents will receive a letter, but what about the managing agents? What about people who don't live in the area? Like if tenants prune a tree not knowing, because they're tenants, and they have to do it for their inspections, or they think they have to, what happens if then they get dobbed in by a neighbour because it's a regulated tree?
Ms Shaw?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So there's nothing under the planning framework that otherwise stops the city commencing prosecution action against the person who committed the offence. So the landowner themselves could be held responsible, or the city could undertake action against a tenant or a tree lopping company. Yeah, that's how we would address that. In terms of the notification going to those landowners who may otherwise live elsewhere, I mean, that's the responsibility of the landowner to receive information related to their property through their property manager, no different to any other notification from the city.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. I might ask a question which I think if I haven't given notice of this one, so I apologise in advance. In your response to Councillor Coveney's question about how long it might take an average development application under this policy to be processed, I thought I heard you mention that we'd try to expedite that because we could be found to be negligent. Does the city have potential liability for negligence if this policy were to be implemented?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. So in terms of whether or not we would be considered negligent, we would need to reasonably foresee that damages would actually occur. So if an application was received and there was information in support of that application that otherwise showed that if the city didn't make a timely decision on that, there could be a case that the city could be found negligent for not making a decision that otherwise made the situation safe.
Okay. If Council will indulge me, I might ask a few questions about enforcement then. The policy does go into some detail in an attempt to define what is a regulated tree, what's considered tree damaging activity, and what's defined as maintenance pruning. And I'm referring to pages 4 and 5 of the draft policy. They appear at pages 6 and 7 of the attachments. If the council approves this policy, and if the council pays, I think you mentioned between $30,000 and $40,000 annually to obtain and maintain the detailed mapping data that you mentioned, will that detailed mapping data be definitive and conclusive in all instances where the city's asked to commence a prosecution? Because I think you mentioned this is a starting point.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Yes, that's the case. I think the data itself would unlikely have the specificity to otherwise result in a successful prosecution alone. It would be the starting point for us to determine what tree may otherwise constitute a regulated tree, for us to then consider that if there were any issues or proposed tree damaging activity to what could be a regulated tree.
All right, thank you for that. So I guess to flesh out that point, the definition of maintenance pruning expressly excludes, quote, removing limbs with a diameter of 100 millimetres or more, end quote, so 10 centimetres. I'm guessing from the answer you've just given me that the detailed mapping data that's referred to at page 11 of the officer report, that's not going to be able to show whether or not a branch was more or less than 10 centimetres thick.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Yes, that's correct. So, for example, if we received notification that a tree was being pruned or attempted to be removed, we would need to undertake an investigation ourselves, and there would need to be evidence on the site, and that's where we would go about gathering evidence to see whether or not the tree itself met the criteria contained within the policy. If there was evidence, we would need to see whether or not it's in the public interest to then undertake prosecution action, and we would need sufficient evidence to be satisfied that we should undertake that process.
All right, I think I know what the answer to this question is going to be, but in that case, let's say the city finds a 15 centimetre diameter tree branch outside House A during a green waste collection week. How would the city know that that 15 centimetre diameter tree branch wasn't dumped in front of House A by people living at House B, for example?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. We wouldn't. Again, as part of a normal course of an investigation, we would seek to interview people, or we would try and gather evidence that would otherwise assist in a prosecution. But the reality is there may be circumstances where we don't know where that came from or who undertook the works.
All right, thank you. And if the city is of the view that tree damaging activity has occurred to a regulated tree, but the city doesn't know exactly who committed that tree damaging activity, maybe it was Mum, maybe it was Dad, maybe it was Billy, maybe it was Jane, maybe it was a private tree lopping company, who would the city prosecute in those circumstances?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. We wouldn't have sufficient evidence if we didn't know who to bring the prosecution action against, and we wouldn't commence that process.
All right, thank you. Okay, so I'll turn to the definition of maintenance pruning in the draft policy. And one of the things, there's 6 elements to this definition, but one of the things that's going to be considered to be maintenance pruning is the first pruning of the tree in the calendar year and affects less than 10% of the canopy, not altering the overall shape of the canopy, end quote. So my first question about that is, does that mean that any pruning of a regulated tree beyond the first pruning in a calendar year will not qualify as maintenance pruning and will therefore be unlawful activity without development approval from the city?
Thank you. Yes, that's correct. If the pruning that happened after the first pruning of the calendar year is greater than 10% of the canopy and did not alter the overall shape of the canopy.
All right, so just so I understand you correctly, if there's been a first pruning in a calendar year, you can't do a second pruning unless you've got development approval from the city?
If you are seeking to prune more than 10% of that canopy, that's correct. You would need development approval to do the additional pruning.
All right. And how could residents prune regulated trees, let's say to protect the gutters of the family home, or maybe prune away from the neighbouring fence line or even the neighbour's gutters without altering the overall shape of the canopy? I would have thought that was necessary if you're going to trim away from gutters.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So there are two parts to it. One, they could either make an application and receive development approval to do so, or they would need to leave the tree as is and clean the gutters.
All right, thank you. Most tree pruning, I assume, is likely to happen immediately before the city's green waste collections. We do 2 of these a year. I assume that our residents would need to have submitted their development applications to the city and had those applications approved before Green Waste Collection Week. If the city were to prosecute a resident for breaching the draft policy, how could our hypothetical resident prove that they only removed 10% or less of the tree's canopy, or that they didn't alter the overall shape of the canopy, or that they didn't remove any limbs with a diameter of 10 centimetres or more in circumstances where the city has probably collected and destroyed the relevant evidence before our hypothetical resident realises they're being prosecuted?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Without the sufficient evidence, we wouldn't undertake prosecution action in the first instance. So if the city's contractors had destroyed the evidence through the green waste collection, then we would not go about prosecuting the landowner.
All right. 2 more questions. I'm nearly there, I promise. If council were to implement this policy, what would stop property owners across the district from cutting down regulated trees or soon to be regulated trees before the policy becomes operative in an attempt to avoid potential prosecutions once the policy becomes active?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Nothing, because there are no statutory protections for trees at the moment. And as I was saying earlier, the only way to stop a tree being cut down is to not cut it down.
Thank you. And my final question is the state government maybe the better placed tier of government to deal with this issue rather than local government?
Thank you. I believe so, yes. And in our response to the original notice of motion, we provided some information about how we considered the state government could address this issue. The city's preference would be that the planning and development local planning schemes regulations are otherwise amended to include tree removal as a development and set some parameters in the exemption section to otherwise set what's effectively contained within this policy position. As we're all aware, the state government hasn't adopted that position to date and hasn't introduced legislation that otherwise makes it an offence to remove a tree. And in response to that, WALGA had prepared the model template, which we are considering, or council is considering, next Tuesday. So our preference is to have uniform provisions statewide. However, in the absence of that, this policy has been presented to attempt to make tree removal works that otherwise required development approval.
Thank you very much. That's all from me. Councillor Choi.
Yes, thank you, Mr Mayor. I'm just wondering, is the city aware of any wholesale clearing of trees on both private and leased land since this draft policy was put out for community consultation? And given what we've learnt just now about the many more months it might be required to collect the required data to enable prosecution, are there any concerns that if council does endorse this planning policy next week, that there may be a wholesale clearing of trees on private land than otherwise would be?
Ms Shaw?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. We're not aware of any broadacre style clearing, but we're also not a Greenfield Development Council. We are aware of some instances where individual trees have been proposed to be removed, or the Strata Council has sought advice, or landowners have made us aware of intentions to remove a tree. The notable example that we had was at 39 South Perth Esplanade, which is a lemon-scented gum that's quite prominent and visible from the foreshore. But we haven't actually had any broad clearing that I'm aware of otherwise.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillors, any further questions on this item this evening? No. Next item, please, Mr Bradford.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. Item 10.3.2, proposed alterations and additions to single house and home business office, Lot 3, number 151 Angelo Street, South Perth. The purpose of this report is to consider an application for development approval for alterations and additions to a single house and a change of use to a home business office on Lot 3, number 151 Angelo Street, South Perth. The item is referred to council as the proposal includes a home business land use under the local planning scheme number 7, which is a non-residential use in the residential zone. 3 objections to the proposal were received during the advertising period, and the proposal therefore falls outside the delegation to officers. For the reasons outlined in the report, it is recommended that the application be approved subject to conditions.
Thank you, Mr Bradford. Councillors, any questions? Councillor Choi?
Yes, thanks, Mr Mayor. I see 3 objections were received on this development application by adjoining or nearby property owners. And so if this item is approved by council, subject to the conditions outlined in the officer recommendation, how will the city ensure the conditions are met, and what recourse will the adjoining neighbours have if issues do arise from the alterations and change in property use?
Ms Shaw?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. So should the applicant fail to comply with the conditions of development approval, should council approve the application, enforcement action would be available in accordance with the Planning and Development Act. So that includes things like the operation of the facility itself being inconsistent with the conditions that have been recommended, or if the development itself is not undertaken in accordance with the approved plans. Similar to the trees, the offence for that is up to $200,000 for an individual or $1 million for a corporation. And the way the neighbours would be able to take action is that they would make a formal complaint to the city, and then we would undertake an investigation to see whether or not there was a breach of the conditions of development approval.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillors, any further questions on this item? No. Next item, please, Mr Bradford.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. Item 10.3.3, proposed childcare premises, Lot 21 and 22, number 15 and 17 Bowman Street, South Perth. The purpose of this report is to consider an application for development approval for a childcare premises at Lot 21 and Lot 22, number 15 and number 17 Bowman Street, South Perth. This item is referred to council as the proposed use falls outside of the delegation to officers. For the reasons outlined in the report, it is recommended that the application be approved, subject to conditions.
Thank you, Mr Bradford. Councillor Choi?
Yes, thank you, Mr Mayor. We heard a deputation from a resident earlier this evening, and I'm just wondering if the city would like to comment on any of the concerns that were raised during that deputation, please.
Ms Shaw?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. So the deputation was seeking to amend one of the conditions that effectively, at condition number 26, the city was seeking to ensure that side and rear boundary fencing behind the building line was masonry fencing up to 1.8 metres for both noise attenuation and amenity reasons. So we were seeking for the existing colour-bond fence to be replaced. The applicant was seeking to have or similar inserted into that condition to provide for materials that act in a similar nature to masonry construction but are less expensive, and the city has no opposition to that as long as it is to our satisfaction at the time of attempting to clear that condition, and that it meets the noise attenuation requirements.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. And Councillor Choi, just to clarify, I'm aware there were 2 deputations, one in favour, one against. Was that the one you're referring to?
Yes, thank you, Mr Mayor. No, I was referring to the one against. I understand there was one with regards to amendment of a condition, which I think Director Shaw has just explained, but there was also a number of concerns that were raised in the deputation against. So thanks for that clarification, Mr Mayor.
I think that was Mrs Schoberg. Can I throw to you on that one, Ms Shaw?
Yes, thank you. So despite the age of the occupants of the adjacent development, that land use is not an aged care facility. It's a mixed-use development. This site is capable of having a childcare centre approved on it, and the city's assessment is outlined in the report. So there's no restriction for council being able to consider this development application for approval.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillor Choi?
Yes, thank you, Mr Mayor. Just one more question. So I note 2 objections were received on this development application by adjoining or nearby property owners. And so if this application is approved by council subject to the conditions outlined in the Office of Recommendation, and if for whatever reason any of those conditions were to change, such as the opening hours or maximum child and staff numbers, would this item have to come back to council for redeliberation?
Ms Shaw?
Thank you. So the existing delegation provides that any application previously determined by council would otherwise be considered by council again. The only exception is if the amendment to the original development application was of a minor nature. So it really depends on what the application was for. If the applicant was seeking to have 1 additional staff member and there were no implications on car parking, it's unlikely it would need to come back to council. But if they were seeking to extend the number of children at the facility that would otherwise have noise and car parking implications, then we would bring the application back to council for them to consider.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillors, any further queries, questions on this item? Councillor Brenda Abrandis.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. This might have been partially answered, but just with regard to Ms Schoberg, she raised a few issues. Were they valid planning considerations, and did we actually address those adequately? Is there any need to be concerned about the items she's raised?
Ms Shaw?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. They were valid planning considerations in respect to car parking, traffic and noise. I think she had only read the summary of the submission in the body of the report and not the attachment. That was it seemed that from what she was saying. But regardless, the city has addressed those issues in the report and has recommended the application for approval, subject to conditions that otherwise address those concerns.
Thank you, Director Shaw.
Any further questions on this item, councillors? No. Next item, please, Mr Bradford.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. Item 10.4.1, listing of payments June 2024. This report presents to council a list of accounts paid under delegated authority between 1 and 30 June 2024 for information. It also includes purchase card transactions between 1 and 31 May 2024 in line with new legislative requirements.
Thank you, Mr Bradford. Councillors, Councillor Choi?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Just one question. Just wondering what the 1 Main Street Pty Ltd payment is for, which entity I understand is a subsidiary of Finbar applicable to the Civic Heart development, and are there any more payments to Finbar expected in relation to this development, please?
I'm pretty sure that that's to do with the landscaping as part of their development application that was completed.
Ms Shaw, anything to add to that?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. We believe it's the bond for the landscaping. We can check.
Thank you. Any further questions on this item, councillors? Councillor Nevada.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I have 3 questions here. They relate to the cost of contract staff in the June payments. Would the city please provide some clarification on the nature of the activities that contract staff are undertaking that comprise the $262,735.58 in expenditure?
Mr Adams?
So whilst I think you might have gone through and added up all the ones that had contract staff against them in the listing of payments. So just a reminder to councillors that sometimes there's payments in there that invoices have been added together, so they're not all necessarily for the same thing as what the description says, because some of the invoices may be different. So some of those ones for contract staff are to a firm that provided some other services as well. So one of those firms provided some services to do with providing safe work method statements for our health, work health and safety. So there was about $110,000 worth of work that they did for us there. So that wasn't actually contract staff. So it was about $150,000 that related to contract staff. So they were primarily used to fill temporary vacancy positions, mainly in the operations area and predominantly in the parks teams. Yeah, so that's primarily the areas that they work in. And obviously we only use contract staff where we've got those vacancies to fill. There's also probably some recruitment of staff that go on to fill some permanent positions in the organisation as well. So some of them start off as contract staff and end up filling permanent positions.
Well,
Next question, Councillor Navard.
yes, thank you. Taking into account that the actual contract staff costs might be in the vicinity of $150,000, what fraction of the total outlay on staff labour this month would the contract staff payments therefore comprise?
So because this is an end of financial year statement, we pushed the companies to provide all of their invoices that they perhaps would have been a bit later and spread out over a couple of months. So there's probably some May and June invoices in there, whereas maybe the June ones would have perhaps been provided a bit later if we hadn't pushed them. Given that, there's May and June invoices in there, and it represents probably about 6% of the costs that are related to staff labour.
Thank you, Mr Adams. And your third question, Councillor Navard.
I think that one's probably covered. Thank you.
All right. Any further questions on this item, councillors? Nope. Next item, please, Mr Bradford.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. Item 10.4.2, monthly financial statements, June 2024 interim. The monthly financial statements interim are provided within the attachments A through I with a high level of analysis contained in the comments of the report.
Thank you, Mr Bradford. Councillors, any questions on this item? Councillor Brenda Abrandis.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. With regard to the operating surplus, it's quite a great result actually. Of that surplus, are we anticipating that we've got will have a significant impact with regard to late invoices that will be coming through still, or have we got them mostly included at 30 June?
Mr Lecoq, can I send that in your direction?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Councillor Brandis, it's difficult to estimate. We did our best endeavours to collect all outstanding invoices, and we encouraged everybody to submit. However, you would still see that there would be some trickling through. It's difficult to estimate or quantify them at this stage.
Thank you. Councillor Brenda Abrandis.
Thank you, Mr Lecoq, and thank you, Mr Mayor. A question just with regard to the capital costs. Again, a significant underspend. Would we have any significant capital costs that would be earmarked for adjustment through the mid-year review process that would need to be carried over?
Mr Lecoq.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Councillor Brandis, we would deal with the carry forwards different than what we've done in the past. You may recall that last year we established a process to deal with carry forwards around about August, September, through a report to council and then adjustment. Having a quick look at figures available at this stage, if you were to ask me to do a quick quantification, I estimated carry forwards potentially in the region of $1.5 million. But that is subject to confirmation, and typically the capital area is where we see the bulk of invoices coming through after the financial year end.
Thank you, Mr Lecoq. Councillor Brenda Brandis.
No, thank you, Mr Lecoq.
Mr Adams, anything to add?
Just gonna add that some of the underspends that you might see in there have already been rebudgeted for in this financial year. You would have seen that some of the things, particularly some of the RAF spending that was in there, has already been rebudgeted for, so that won't be a carry forward. But as Mr Lecoq said, there are some carry forwards there, so it's not as great as the total underspend.
Thank you, Mr Adams. Councillor Cridland.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Question to Director Adams. I note that the City holds 37% of its cash investments in institutions that don't provide fossil fuel lending and 63% in financial institutions that do provide fossil fuel lending. Is that the preponderance of cash being held in institutions that provide fossil fuel lending, because they are more solid, more successful than their peers who don't? And is it because fossil fuels are the outstanding sector, in particular coal, on the share market this year, or is that just a coincidence?
Mr Adams.
No, it's to do with our investment policy and the way that we're required to break up our investments into. Fossil fuels is only one consideration, but we're required to break it up into the higher rated investments and only have a certain percentage into higher rated banks as opposed, or investment institutions, and as well as a percentage in the lower rated investment institutions. So it's the fossil fuel is only one consideration. So we've got those other considerations in breaking it up and having percentages spread across the different ratings of the institutions. So if council wants us to review the investment policy so that we can have more in the non-fossil fuel investments, then we're happy to bring it back for council consideration. But that's essentially the reason, is just so as we get that diversification of the investments across the different range of ratings in the institutions. So, as I said, fossil fuel investments only one consideration. It's a preferred. If we can go with a preferred non-fossil fuel investment that meets the other investment criteria, then we'll do that. But if it means breaching the other covenants that we've got on the investment portfolio, then we can't do that. So we have to go with fossil fuel investment provider.
Thank you, Mr Adams. Councillors, any further questions on this item? Councillor Navard.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. This is really a follow-on from the question that Councillor Brenda Brandis asked, and it's relating to the Capital Works projects, which was referenced on page 45. And really it was just to ask whether those projects that were rolled through to the current financial year, would any of those present a risk for the city? Thank you.
Mr Adams.
No, I guess none of them present any significant risk when we're talking about, the sorts of things that presented the highest risk were addressed through the budget discussions. Things being things like drainage assets and irrigation assets and things like that. The projects that have been delayed, again, have been prioritised. Two projects that I think were of significant importance that were delayed had some unforeseen issues that delayed them. Those issues have now been resolved, I think, Director Primo, and those will now go ahead. and the other ones, as I said, have been reprioritised through the current budget process. So I don't think there's anything in there that creates any risk for council going forward, given that we've just adopted the new budget, and that has a new capital works plan that has a set of prioritised capital works projects in it.
Thank you, Mr Adams. Any further questions, councillors? No. Next item, please, Mr Bradford.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. Item 10.4.3, City of South Perth Honour Boards. This report outlines the current condition and location of the city's honour boards and a solution for their future preservation and public display.
Thank you, Mr Bradford. Councillor Choi, a question?
Yes, thank you, Mr Mayor. Just got a couple of questions. I understand from the officer's report that unfortunately the names on some of the older boards have become difficult to discern due to the lack of contrast and the ageing of the materials. But I also understand from an example, I believe the Deputy earlier this evening has undertaken himself with frosting the back of those acrylic boards that you can then see the names and it does actually bring up the boards. And apparently it's not a very expensive way of, representing them. So I'm just wondering whether the city could entertain an exercise of like doing one, like frosting the back of one acrylic board and bringing it back to council so we can actually have a look. This is not to depart from the city's recommendation with regards to the digital sign. I think that's all great, but it's just about what we can still do with those existing honour boards in terms of a really minimal cost-effective way of maybe bringing them back to life.
Mr Adams, should I send that in your direction?
Yeah, I think, and Morgan might be able to correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the issues was in finding somebody who was able to and willing to do anything at all to those honour boards, given that it's not something that any of the people who do honour boards now are willing to put their name to, because they don't do it anymore. So, Morgan can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you were struggling a bit there, Morgan, to get anyone to actually do any work on those honour boards at all. So I'm not sure we'd be able to get anyone to just do one. Yeah, I think that was more the issue, wasn't it, Morgan? Yeah.
I'll just add that in any event, if we were to get someone to do it, we still have the issue of public display and where to put them.
Thank you, Mr Adams and Mr Hindle. Another question, Councillor Choi?
Yes, thanks, Mr Mayor. Now, is it possible to please at least put the most recent honour boards that are legible back into the councillors' lounge where they were previously?
Mr Adams?
It's possible to do anything, just requires a council decision. If council want us to put the honour boards back in the council lounge, then we can do that. But I guess our advice was that perhaps the best way of doing it was to go down this path. But we can put them in there if that's what council decides that they that it wants us to do. Our recommendation is, as per the report, that we go down the electronic path because it enables more people to see them and enables us to maintain the names and put all the history up there for everybody to be able to see it in a legible manner.
Thank you, Mr Adams. Any further questions of this item, councillors? No. Okay. That brings us to item 12, which is motions of which previous notice has been given. The first is item 12.1, which is a notice of motion from me, Mayor Greg Milner, entitled Indoor Sporting Facilities in the City of South Perth. Councillors, does anyone have any questions on this item? Councillor Choi.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. Look, my understanding is that the lead petitioner, who I believe we heard from this evening through his deputation, has reached out to potential stakeholders, including with the City of South Perth, in the last month or so, and has received in principle support from the City for the State Government to use the relevant Crown land in Kensington on the Town of Victoria Park side for the development of indoor sports courts, and hence I'm just wondering why this motion is necessary.
Thank you. Ms Shaw.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. So the motion itself doesn't specifically refer to the e-petition and the location itself, although reference to the campaign for indoor courts has been included in the reasons that have been provided by the Mayor. The notice of motion itself is just to seek that council recognises the chronic shortfall in sporting facilities within the district, and for the CEO to write to the local members as such.
Mr Bradford.
And just to clarify the discussions we did have with the Perth Redbacks, we agree that the DPIRD site is a potential site, but we know that there are a whole bunch of, it's a state government site, so it's not under our control for a start, and also there's a whole bunch of statutory planning processes that need to take place before it could be used. And so our discussion with them was really agreeing with the need for indoor sports courts, and that is one potential site amongst others, including potentially George Burnett for sports courts.
I guess I'll just ask a follow-up question there. Have we been told that the site's been given in-principle support? That's not something I knew.
No.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Choi?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Sorry, so when I think you were just clarifying a part of my question, were you just then?
That's right, yeah. I thought maybe you knew something I didn't, which...
No, but I believed that, so maybe, please correct me if I'm wrong. So I thought my understanding was that the city had provided support, or in-principle support, towards the state government if they wanted to use that site. The city obviously had no objections because it's not our site.
It's not our site, so we haven't provided any in-principle support. We absolutely agree with the need for indoor sports courts and have identified the DPIRD site as a possible site, as one of several possible sites.
Okay, thank you for that clarification, and apologise if I misunderstood that then from what I'd information I looked at earlier. So just following on from my last question, I just want to ensure that this motion is not going to sort of bind the city at all financially. Like if we are indicating support for something, then they might come knocking on our door saying, oh, okay, well, have you got some in-principle funds to offer towards potentially a facility that's not within the district?
I can't see that anything in the notice of motion binds the city in any way.
Thank you, Councillor Choi and Mr Bradford. Councillors, any further questions on this item? No. Okay. In that case, we move to item 12.2, which is a notice of motion from Councillor Nick Coveney entitled Public Art at the South Perth Foreshore. Councillors, any questions for the administration on this item this evening? I think Councillor Brenda Brandis was first.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Just could I have clarification on the process? So obviously the committee that oversees the art projects, do they not provide us with recommendations with regard to proposals for artwork and also locations?
Ms Shaw?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Yeah, we have a public art master plan. Either when the city prepares a public art proposal or where there's a developer-led proposal for public art, we take that artwork through the public art reference group for their input and consideration, and then we make a decision based on that advice.
Thank you. Councillor Brenda Brandis.
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and thank you, Director Shaw. Just with regard to specifically the South Perth Foreshore Mill Point Ward, do we have any indication how much funding is allocated in that reserve that would be specifically allocable for that location?
Ms Shaw?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. So no, the way that the guidelines themselves actually work is such that it identifies that as funds become available, we would seek to provide public artwork in those locations. So it doesn't necessarily commit the city to providing artwork within a set time frame within each of the different precincts within the guidelines. As of February, we've got a public art reserve of approximately $398,000. Those funds could be used towards public artworks within that location, should council choose.
Thank you, Ms Shaw. Councillors, any further questions? Councillor Choi, I think, was first there.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. So just following on from Councillor Brenda Brandis' question with regards to the reserve, I do recall something about that money, some of that money being earmarked for something, some project, but I just can't recall what it was, or maybe that's no longer exists. But I didn't think that all of it could go into one particular project or one particular precinct. I thought it was something, it was community benefit that sort of had to be sort of dispersed.
Ms. Shaw?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm not aware of any specific public art projects that the reserve funds otherwise allocated towards. What you may be referring to is where we receive developer contributions. It's typical that you would expend the money within the precinct to which the contributions were collected.
Thank you, Ms. Shaw. Councillor Nevada, I thought I saw your hand go up there.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. In the appendices of the motion, there are examples of tourist attractants, and by that I mean the photo of Brisbane, the Eye Amsterdam, and the Singapore by the Bay, and the Table Mountain photo frame. So, to my way of thinking, they are quite clearly strategies for attracting people to the location. Therefore, I was just wondering about the intention of having artworks only, or might it be that this motion is actually dealing with two things, and so therefore there's more than one funding source that would be required to address the material?
Ms. Shaw?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So if the proposal met the definition of public art, we could consider use of the public art reserve for that purpose. If it was considered something else, we don't have a specific budget allocation to provide for that, so we would need a funding source before we could implement that piece of infrastructure.
Thank you, Ms. Shaw. Councillor Choi?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm just wondering to ask about capacity, because I think at last month's meeting we were talking about wasn't just the expense of infrastructure, but it was the capacity to meet the installation of new infrastructure and for contractors to be found to put that infrastructure in. I'm just wondering, does this sort of carry any of those sort of same concerns or risks?
Ms. Shaw?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So unlike other types of infrastructure, public art is largely manufactured by the artists themselves. So we would seek some commitments from the artists as to the time frame on when they could manufacture that piece of art and install the artwork. So slightly different to typical types of infrastructure like footpaths and stormwater infrastructure and the like. It's likely that we could find an artist who would otherwise be available to manufacture and install the artwork.
Thank you, Ms. Shaw. Councillor Choi?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and through the Chair to Director Shaw. Would there be any specific location that the city would be including in their report back or discussing with the Public Art Committee if this was endorsed to go to them for recommendations, or would it be something that's left to council to decide at that point in time?
Ms. Shaw?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. It depends on the type of artwork itself, but typically public artworks need to be clearly seen from and or located in the public realm. So, for example, it could be located in a prominent position on the foreshore, but we would need to run that through the Public Art Reference Group to consider whether or not the artwork is appropriate in its context.
Thank you, Ms. Shaw. Any other questions, councillors? Councillor Choi?
Thank you. And my last question, again through the Chair to Director Shaw. So my understanding is that RAC artwork, which was I think 50-50 between RAC for the Intellibus, I think, initiative and the city, was from recollection $600,000. Is that correct? And we paid, was it $500,000 and we paid half of that?
Ms. Shaw, I'd forgive you if you wanted to take that one on notice.
No, my understanding is that it was around $500,000 and there was a co-contribution towards that. The cost of artwork itself ranges depending on the scale of the artwork. So you could be potentially looking at, $10,000 to $100,000. It really depends on the size and what the artwork is made of.
We might actually just confirm that the amount for that one, because I'm not sure.
Any further questions, councillors? No. Okay. We now turn to item 12.3, which is a notice of motion from Councillor Blake D'Souza entitled Community Consultation for Tree Planting / Tree Removals. Councillors, do we have any questions for the administration? Councillor Brenda Abrandis.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I've got a few questions, so I can ask a few questions and allow some of my other elected member colleagues to ask some. Okay, so firstly, paragraph 2A requires extensive consultation with regard to this motion, and that includes written notice to adjacent residents, which I expect would include neighbours either side of the planned verge planting and the opposite neighbour. As such, 4 residents would require consultation for each tree at a minimum. Does the administration have the resource capacity to undertake this level of consultation, and how much of an additional burden would this have on the environment team to administer?
Thank you, Councillor Brenda Brandis. Ms Amprimo, can I send that your way?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. The city is not really resourced to undertake this level of consultation on a project of this nature, and it would require additional resources from various business units within the infrastructure services and also from communications and stakeholder engagement.
Thank you, Ms Amprimo. Councillor Brenda Brandis.
This motion presents many more opportunities to prevent one tree being planted on one verge, with the approval now requiring significant consultation with many stakeholders. As a worst case scenario, this would require the consultation of up to 4 or possibly more adjacent residents, depending on the property. Does the administration consider the proposal would have a detrimental impact on the number of trees planted and the overall success or failure of the urban greening program?
Ms Amprimo.
So it is likely to result, in less trees being planted. Also, the notice of motion is silent on how to resolve a situation where one resident supports installation of a tree, but the other one doesn't support it or simply doesn't respond. And it also references residents only. However, the city's practice is to correspond with the owners as well as residents, where the owner is not resident in the property. So there's a few things there. I'm actually unclear from this whether we would end up planting any trees at all, because we generally don't get feedback in the affirmative.
Thank you, Ms Amprimo. Councillor Brenda Brandis.
Thank you, Ms Amprimo. Just following on from that last comment, so obviously consultation with the owners and also residents might result in different outcomes. So again, you're indicating that we'd have no way for actually managing those differences of views on tree planting or otherwise?
Ms Amprimo.
Yeah, we normally don't get very many responses in support of something. So we would get the objections, but for residents to come back and support it, that's not something that we commonly get when we go through public consultation. So also the question arises for me as to, do we only send one letter, and if we get no response, do we follow that up and assume that it's a no response, therefore we don't plant?
Thank you, Ms Amprimo. Councillor Brenda Brandis.
Thank you, Ms Amprimo. That answers my next question, which I planned. With time delays, would this motion, what time delays would this motion have on undertaking the urban greening project? And could this result in the failure of the program? I'm just mindful of the fact that the consultation period is quite significant, and also is delayed by a number of weeks, and also bringing this matter back to council.
Ms Amprimo.
Yeah, thank you, Mr Mayor. As was pointed out in one of the deputations earlier this evening, we would not be able to, if we went through this process, we would not be able to plant within the planting season, and we would also be out of time in terms of the grant acquittal requirements. So effectively, as the notice of motion is written, we would go through a public consultation process that then meant we were in a position where we couldn't do the work because we no longer had the access to the funding.
Thank you, Ms Amprimo. Any further questions, Councillor Brenda Brandis?
Yes, Mr Mayor, I've got a few more.
Okay, far away.
Is the administration aware of any other local governments that have these provisions that require consultation with adjacent neighbours and that they all need to be supportive to plant one tree. And also, in the instance where there is no response, that actually results in no verge tree being planted.
Ms Amprima?
Yeah, thank you, Mr Mayor. The city's been unable to locate any other local government that has a policy of that kind. The ones that we looked at, they were all actions that encouraged or supported the planting of trees within the verge.
Councillor Brenda Abrandis?
Thank you. And this question sort of follows on from the previous question. So do we actually have any policy or guideline that sort of requires this level of consultation, which is significant consultation, and this is a burden for the administration? Would this also set a precedent?
Ms Amprima?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. So the local planning policy advertising of planning proposals would be the nearest policy that would give a sense of the requirement of this kind of consultation. The stakeholder engagement policy doesn't address it specifically. It would be a significant amount of work, and there'd be concerns that this would set a precedent for broader consultation on other matters. And so not only is this additional consultation relating to this, but if we had to apply that to other things, that would significantly increase the amount of work that we did.
Thank you, Ms Amprima. Councillor Brenda Abrandis?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Thank you, Director Amprimo. Following on from the previous question, so if this does become a precedent with regard to consultation for planting verge trees, what sort of impact would this have on the administration and the staff requirements to actually administer these programs?
Ms Amprima?
Yeah, thank you, Mr Mayor. We haven't been able to quantify how much impact that would have in terms of resources, but we would certainly need to have more staff available to process letters, identify who they had to go to, monitor the responses, collate the responses, liaise between the different departments internally to get the responses together.
Thank you, Ms Amprima. Councillor Brenda Abrandis?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Thank you, Director Amprimo. This evening we heard deputations and the concern about the urban heat map, and it is quite alarming in these areas, and we do need to actually address that issue. So with regard to this motion and the long-term urban heat map in the planned locations for tree planting, what sort of impact would this actually have with the Urban Greening Grants Program?
Ms Amprima?
Yeah, thank you, Mr Mayor. So, as noted earlier, these are areas of low canopy and high heat. If this notice of motion is successful, as I noted in response to the other questions earlier, effectively we would not be able to acquit the grant in time, so we wouldn't be able to plant the trees through that programme. And obviously, without planting those trees, we're not going to be able to mitigate the heat island and improve the canopy.
Thank you, Ms Amprima. Councillor Brenda Abrandis?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Thank you, Director Amprimo. Are there any proposed urban greening program trees as part of this planting program that would interfere with the river views in Carrawarra, Waterford, Signia Cove, as this is one of the clauses that needs to be considered? And if not, what is the reason for including the provision in this motion?
Ms Amprima?
Yeah, thank you, Mr Mayor. So we haven't been able to identify any of the trees that would impact with the river views. I can't comment on why that would be included in the notice of motion.
Thank you, Ms Amprima. Councillor Brenda Abrandis?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Thank you, Director Amprimo. We've just recently completed the 24-25 budget, and that was approved unanimously. Can I please have confirmation with regard to the budget approval, if this had been included as an item that we did actually approve as a program and a project for tree planting this year?
Ms Amprima?
Yeah, thank you, Mr Mayor. So the grant was awarded at the end of February, and at that time the condition of the grant was that it had to be completed by the 30th of June. So it actually is sitting in the finances for the 23-24 financial year. there was an extension due to the weather conditions, lack of rain, to the end of July. But currently, the majority of those funds relate to the purchase of trees from our nursery, which is effectively an internal transaction between the nursery and the project. And I believe that transaction was processed in the 23-24 financial year. And I'm just looking at Arbery there. Yep, that's correct.
Thank you, Ms Amprimo. Many questions left, Councillor Brenda Brandis?
No, thank you, Mr Mayor. That's my final question. Thank you, Director Amprimo.
All right, thank you. Councillor Cridland?
Sorry, Director Amprimo, I have a question. Following the last presenter this evening from the public, is the city considering not taking out the olive trees as part of this program?
Ms Amprimo?
Thank you, Mr Mayor. So the city is not taking any action on removing trees or planting trees under this programme until such time as council has considered this notice of motion. Obviously, if this notice of motion is approved by council, then we have clear direction and that would result in the programme ceasing. If the notice of motion was unsuccessful, then we would seek to go back to discuss with residents that have raised concerns with us and see if we could resolve those.
Thank you, Ms Amprimo. And this question may have been touched on earlier, but I guess I'll ask, why is the city removing olive trees at this stage?
Yeah, thank you, Mr Mayor. So the olive trees have quite a long history, I think around 20-25 years, and they are currently very heavily pruned. And that came about because the city was approached by many residents in the past around not allowing the olive trees to grow big and to manage the amount of fruit off them and minimise that. So in response to feedback from the community, those trees are very heavily pruned. As a result, from the heat mapping and the canopy mapping, they leave that area of the city with a very low canopy and excess heat. So the intent behind removing them and replacing with something that would provide those benefits to the community in that area was that previously we had feedback from the community that they didn't want the olive trees to be big and to be heavily fruiting. I acknowledge through this process it's maybe come to light that the community have a slightly different view on those trees now, and there is the potential for us to allow them to grow and provide some of that canopy cover that they currently don't provide.
Thank you. Councillor D'Souza.
Just one question, Mr Mayor. So had this motion not been put, the olive trees might have been removed, is that correct?
Ms Amprimo?
No, I don't believe that that is correct. We have had a reasonable amount of feedback from the community, and we don't require a notice of motion from council to go back and continue talking to the community. So we always seek to try and talk to residents where they do have an objection to something and see if we can find a suitable resolution. It may have been that some residents, when we investigated further, wanted the olive trees replaced with something else, and some wanted them retained. So there could have been a hybrid outcome, but ultimately council will obviously consider this notice of motion and we'll have some direction one way or another.
Thank you, Ms Amprimo. Councillor Choi?
Yes, thanks, Mr Mayor. I'm just wondering what the implications are with this motion. I think some of it's been discussed, but I was going to ask that as a general question. I'm also wondering whether we can, if it's possible, what the implication would be of someone amending it to have public consultation for tree removals but not tree plantings.
Ms Amprima?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. So if the consultation was to continue in line with what's currently in the notice of motion, effectively the purpose of tree removal was to provide space to establish new trees and provide canopy within those particular streets. If we have to go through that consultation process to remove the trees, we will be outside of the planting period and will have missed the opportunity to use the grant funding to do that. So we would then not seek to remove the trees because we wouldn't remove the trees to replace them with nothing. So if we either we're going to go through a different process of consultation, potentially, but not the process as it's set out, because that would mean that we couldn't plant the replacement trees.
Thank you, Ms Amprima. Councillor Choi?
Thank you, Mr Mayor, through the Chair to Director Amprimo. So just taking into account what the Deputy was saying earlier on about planting trees and then perhaps down the track removing the other ones once the new saplings have grown to a certain height, would that not be an option with that grant money?
Ms Amprima?
Yeah, thank you, Mr Mayor. There may be some instances where that is possible. However, you have to consider the proximity to another tree and the impact that that has. So if there's an olive tree that's not doing particularly well and you plant another tree in close proximity to that, that will impact how the new tree grows and the shape of that new tree and how likely it is to thrive. And also, when we're looking at where we place trees on the verge, we have to take account of things like visibility from driveways, from streets, and other things like services in the ground. Sometimes there's localised areas where the soil conditions aren't suitable to plant a tree, so it's not quite as straightforward as just planting a tree nearby and then waiting to it. If the tree is so small that it's not going to impact the new tree you've planted, arguably you would just remove it because it isn't really providing a benefit.
Thank you, Ms Amprimo. Councillor Choi?
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and through the Chair to Director Amprimo. So if I get this right, if we endorse this motion, I'm going to try and get my head, I had it in my mind, now I'm trying to understand what I was going to say. If we endorse this motion, we will lose the funding because the city won't be able to go ahead and do what it needed to do under that that program. But if we don't endorse it, then residents may lose their olive trees that they want to, we're hearing tonight they want to retain. Is that correct?
Ms Amprimo?
Yeah, thank you, Mr Mayor. So if council endorses this notice of motion, effectively they'll be instructing the administration to carry out a consultation process for something which the administration would no longer be in a position to implement because we will not be able to meet the grant conditions in terms of time frame. So we would go through a consultation process and then we wouldn't be doing the work because we wouldn't have the funding anymore. In terms of a council don't support this, we've heard very loud and clear from the community that there is an interest in retaining the olive trees. So we would seek to go back to, there is also Waterford and Signia Cove that this impacts. So I don't see any reason why we couldn't progress with planting those areas irrespective. And the olive trees, we can go back and we can talk to the community further, but it wouldn't be within the time frame that's set out in the notice of motion. We would look to do that in a more accelerated way and go back to discuss with the community. And if there are some members of the community who want their olive tree replaced with something else, and it's not a particularly thriving tree, then I think we would certainly look at doing that. If the community want to retain the olive trees and we can allow those canopies to grow and not heavily prune them, then that would also achieve an increased canopy in the area.
Thank you, Ms Amprimo. Councillor Choi?
Yes, thank you. My last question, and thanks, Director Amprimo, for following what I was trying to get out there. It's been a pretty late evening. So looking at the DPLH tree canopy dashboard online, I noticed that Waterford has got the least road reserve tree canopy throughout the district, and is that the reason why there is a concentrated effort on planting trees on the verges at this point in time through this grant?
Ms Amprimo?
Yeah, thank you, Mr Mayor. So the criteria for the grant was canopy cover of less than 10% and an urban heat index of greater than 5. The areas that, through the application process, if you had areas that were higher than that, then they were more likely to succeed. The areas that we've selected have canopy cover in the majority of cases of less than 5% and the urban heat index of over 7. So we went and looked across the city and identified areas that were worst in terms of canopy cover and the heat island effect.
Mr Bradford?
And I'm pretty sure that we have different, more granular data than the DPLH dashboard, which was used to support the grant and identify the area.
Thank you, Ms Amprimo and Mr Bradford. Councillors, any further questions? No. Okay. All right. Ordinarily, if there was a reason to close the meeting to the public at item 15, we would close the meeting to the public, but happily there's no reason to do so. But that does bring us to item 16, which is closure. So before I close this meeting, I'd like to thank everyone for their attendance and participation. I declare this meeting closed at 9:16 p.m. Thank you all and good night.